Chapter 41 of A House Divided Against Itself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joshua Seeger in Chicago. A House Divided Against Itself by Margaret O. Oliphant. Chapter 41. Frances ate a mournful little dinner alone after the agitations to which she had been subject. Her mother did not return, and Markham, who had been expected up to the last moment, did not appear. It was unusual to her now to spend so many hours alone, and her mind was oppressed, not only by the strange scene with Nellie Winterbourne, but more deeply still by Claude's news. George Gaunt had always been a figure of great interest to Frances, and his appearance here in the world, which was as yet so strange, with his grave, indeed melancholy face, had awakened her to a sense of sympathy and friendliness which no one had called forth in her before. He was as strange as she was to that dazzling puzzle of society, sat silent as she did, roused himself into interest, like her, about matters which did not much interest anybody else. She had felt amid so many strangers that here was one whom she could always understand, whose thoughts she could follow, who said what she had been about to say. It made no difference to Frances that he had not signaled her out for special notice. She took that quietly, as a matter of course. Her mother, Markham, the other people who appeared and disappeared in the house, were all more interesting, she felt, than she. But sometimes her eyes had met those of Captain Gaunt in sympathy, and she had perceived that he could understand her, whether he wished to do so or not. And then he was Mrs. Gaunt's youngest, of whom she had heard so much. It seemed to Frances that his childhood and her own had got all entangled, so that she could not be quite sure whether this and that incident of the nursery had been told of him or of herself. She was more familiar with him than he could be with her, and to hear that he was unhappy, that he was in danger, a stranger among people who preyed upon him, and yet not to be able to help him, was almost more than she could bear. She went up to the empty drawing-room with the soft illumination of many lights, which was habitual there, which lay all decorated and bright, sweet with spring flowers, full of pictures and ornaments, like a deserted palace, and she felt the silence and beauty of it to be dreary and terrible. It was like a desert to her, or rather like a prison, in which she must stay and wait and listen, and whatever might come, do nothing to hinder it. What could she do? A girl could not go out into those haunts where Claude Ramsay, though he was so delicate, could go. She could not put herself forward and warn a man who would think he knew much better than she could do. She sat down and tried to read, and then got up, and glided about from one table to another, from one picture to another, looking vaguely at a score of things without seeing them. Then she stole within the shadow of the curtain and looked out at the carriages which went and came, now and then drawing up at adjacent doors. It made her heart beat to see them approaching, to think that perhaps they were coming here. Her mother, perhaps Sir Thomas, perhaps Markham. Was it possible that this night, of all others, this night when her heart seemed to appeal to earth and heaven for someone to help her, nobody would come? It was Frances's first experience of these vigils which to some women fill up so much of life. There had never been any anxiety at Bordighera, any disturbing influence. She had always known where to find her father, who could solve every problem and chase away every difficulty. Would he, she wondered, be able to do so now? Would he, if he were here, go out for her and find George Gaunt and deliver him from his pursuers? But Frances could not say to herself that he would have done so. He was not fond of disturbing himself. He would have said, "It is not my business." He would have refused to interfere as Claude did. And what could she do, a girl, by herself? Lady Markham had been very anxious to keep him out of harm's way, but she had said plainly that she would not forsake her own son in order to save the son of another woman. Frances was wandering painfully through labyrinths of such thoughts, racking her brain with vain questions as to what it was possible to do, when Markham's hansom, stopping with a sudden clang at the door, drove her thoughts away, or at least made a break in them, and replaced, by a nervous tremor of excitement and alarm, the pangs of anxious expectation and suspense. She would rather not have seen Markham at that moment. She was fond of her brother. It grieved her to hear even Lady Markham speak of him in questionable terms. All the natural prejudices of affectionate youth were enlisted on his side, but for the first time she felt that she had no confidence in Markham, and wished that it had been anyone but he. He came in with a light overcoat over his evening clothes. He had been dining out, but he did not meet Frances with the unembarrassed countenance which she had thought would have made it so difficult to speak to him about what she had heard. He came in hurriedly, looking round the drawing-room with a rapid investigating glance, before he took any notice of her. "Where is the mother?" he asked hurriedly. "She has not come back," said Frances, divining from his look that it was unnecessary to say more. Markham sat down abruptly on a sofa near. He did not make any reply to her, but put up the handle of his cane to his mouth with a curious mixture of the comic and the tragic, which struck her in spite of herself. He did not require to put any question. He knew very well where his mother was and all that was happening. The sense of the great crisis which had arrived took from him all power of speech, paralyzing him with mingled awe and dismay. But yet the odd little figure on the sofa, sucking his cane, his hat in his other hand, his features all fallen into bewilderment and helplessness, was absurd. Out of the depths of Frances's trouble came a hysterical titter against her will. This roused him also. He looked at her with a faint, evanescent smile. "Laughing at me, Fan? Well, I don't wonder. I am a nice fellow to have to do with a tragedy. Screaming farce is more like my style." "I did not laugh, Markham. I have not any heart for laughing," she said. "Oh, didn't you? But it sounded like it. Fan, tell me, has the mother been long away, and did anyone see that unfortunate girl when she was here?" "No, Markham, unless it were Mr. Ramsay. He saw her drive away with Mamma." "The worst of old gossips," he said, desperately sucking his cane with a gloomy brow. "I don't know an old woman so bad. No quarter there. That is the word. Fan, the mother is a trump. Nothing is so bad when she is mixed up in it. Was Nellie much cut up, or was she in one of her wild fits? Poor girl! You must not think badly of Nellie. She has had hard lines. She never had a chance. An old brute, used up, that no woman could take to. But she has done her duty by him, Fan." "She does not think so, Markham." "Oh, by Jove, she was giving you that, was she? Fan, I sometimes think poor Nellie's off her head a little. Poor Nellie. Poor girl. I don't want to set her up for an example, but she has done her duty by him. Remember this, whatever you may hear, I am a rather good one to know." He gave a curious little chuckle as he said this, a sort of strangled laugh of which he was ashamed, and stifled it in its birth. "Markham, I want to speak to you about something very serious." He gave a keen look at her sideways from the corner of one eye. Then he said in a sort of whisper to himself, "Preaching?" but added in his own voice, "Fire away, Fan," with a look of resignation. "Markham, it is about Captain Gaunt." "Oh!" he cried. He gave a little laugh. "You frightened me, my dear. I thought at this time of the day you were going to give me a sermon from the depths of your moral experience, Fan. So long as it isn't about poor Nellie, say what you please about Gaunt. What about Gaunt?" "Oh, Markham, Mr. Ramsay told me, and Mamma has been frightened ever since he came. What have you done with him, Markham? Don't you remember the old general at Bordighera, and his mother? And he had just come from India for his holiday after years and years. And they are poor. That is to say, they are well enough off for them, but they are not like Mamma and you. They have not got horses and carriages. They don't live as you do." "As I do? I am the poorest little beggar living, and that is the truth, Fan." "The poorest? Markham, you may think you can laugh at me. I am not clever. I am quite ignorant. That I know. But how can you say you are poor? You don't know what it is to be poor. When they go away in the summer, they choose little quiet places. They spare everything they can. That is one thing I know better than you do, to say you are poor." He rose up and came towards her, and taking her hands in his, gave them a squeeze, which was painful, though he was unconscious of it. "Fan," he said, "all that is very pretty and true for you, but if I hadn't been poor, do you think all this would have happened as it has done? Do you think I'd have stood by and let Nellie marry that fellow? Do you think—" "Hush! There's the mother, with news. No doubt she's got news. Fan, what do you think it'll be?" He held her hands tight and pressed them till she had almost cried out, looking in her face with a sort of nervous smile which twitched at the corners of his mouth, looking in her eyes as if into a mirror where he could see the reflection of something, and so be spared the pain of looking directly at it. She saw that the subject, which was of so much interest to her, had passed clean out of his head. His own affairs were uppermost in Markham's mind, as is generally the case whenever a man can be supposed to have any affairs at all of his own. And Francis, kept in this position as a sort of mirror in which he could see the reflection of his mother's face, saw Lady Markham come in, looking very pale and fatigued, with that air of having worn her outdoor dress for hours, which gives a sort of haggard aspect to weariness. She gave a glance round, evidently without perceiving very clearly who was there, then sank wearily upon the sofa, loosening her cloak. "It is all over," she said in a low tone, as if speaking to herself. "It is all over. Of course I could not come away before." Markham let go Francis's hands without a word. He walked away to the further window and drew the curtain aside and looked out. Why, he could not have told, nor with what purpose, with a vague intention of making sure that the hansom which stood there so constantly was at the door. "What is Markham doing?" said his mother in a faint, querulous tone. "Tell him not to fidget with these curtains. It worries me. I am tired, and my nerves are all wrong. Yes, you can take my cloak, Francis. Don't call anybody. No one will come here tonight. Markham, did you hear what I said? It is all over. I waited till—" He came towards her from the end of the room with a sort of smile upon his grey, sandy-coloured face, his mouth and eyebrows twitching, his eyes screwed up so that nothing but two keen little glimmers of reflection were visible. "You are not the sort," he said, with a little tremor in his voice, "to forsake a man when he is down." He had his hands in his pockets, his shoulders pushed up. Nowhere could there have been a less tragic figure. Yet every line of his odd face was touched and moving with feeling, totally beyond any power of expression in words. "It was not a happy scene," she said. "He sent for her at the last. Sarah Winterbourne was there at the bedside. She was fond of him, I believe. A woman cannot help being fond of her brother, however little he may deserve it. Nellie—" Here Markham broke in with a sound that was like, yet not like, his usual laugh. "How's Nellie?" he said abruptly, without sequence or reason. Lady Markham paused to look at him, and then went on. "Nellie trembled so, I could scarcely keep her up. She wanted not to go, she said. What was the good? But I got her persuaded at last. A man dying like that it is not a pleasant sight." He signed to her to go and kiss him. Lady Markham shuddered slightly. "He was past speaking. I mean, he was past understanding. I wish I had not seen it. One can't get such a scene out of one's mind." She put up her hand and pressed her fingers upon her eyes, as if the picture was there and she was trying to get rid of it. Markham had turned away again, and was examining, or seeming to examine, the flowers in a jardinière. Now and then he made a movement, as if he would have stopped the narrative. Frances, trembling and crying with natural horror and distress, had loosened her mother's cloak and taken off her bonnet while she went on speaking. Lady Markham's hair, though always covered with a cap, was as brown and smooth as her daughter's. Frances put her hand upon it timidly and smoothed the satin braid. It was all she could do to show the emotion, the sympathy in her heart, and she was as much startled in mind as physically when Lady Markham suddenly threw one arm round her and rested her head upon her shoulder. "Thank God," the mother cried, "that here is one, whatever may happen, that will never, never—" Francis, my love, don't mind what I say. I am worn out and good for nothing. Go and get me a little wine, for I have no strength left in me." Markham turned to her with his chuckle more marked than ever, as Francis left the room. "I am glad to see that you have strength to remember what you're about, mammy, in spite of that little breakdown. It wouldn't do, would it, to let Francis believe that a match like Winterbourne was a thing she would never, though it wasn't amiss for poor Nelly in her day." "Markham, you are very hard upon me. The child did not understand either one thing or the other, and I was not to blame about Nelly. You cannot say I was to blame. If I had been, I think tonight might make up. That ghastly face, and Nelly's close to it, with her eyes staring in horror, the poor little mouth." Markham's exclamation was short and sharp like a pistol shot. It was a monosyllable, but not one to be put into print. "Stop that," he said. "It can do no good going over it. Who's with her now?" "I could not stay, Markham. Besides, it would have been out of place. She has her maid, who is very kind to her, and I made them give her a sleeping draught to make her forget her trouble. Sarah Winterbourne laughed out when I asked for it. The doctor was shocked. It was so natural that poor little Nelly, who never saw anything so ghastly, never was in the house with death, never saw, much less touched." "I can understand Sarah," he said with a grim smile. Frances came back with the wine, and her mother paused to kiss her as she took it from her hand. "I am sure you have had a wearing, miserable evening. You look quite pale, my dear. I ought not to speak of such horrid things before you at your age. But you see, Markham, she saw Nelly and heard her wild talk. It was all excitement and misery and overstrain, for in reality she had nothing to reproach herself with, nothing, Francis. He proved that by sending for her, as I tell you. He knew, and everybody knows, that poor Nelly had done her duty by him." Frances paid little attention to this strange defence. She was, as her mother knew, yet could scarcely believe, totally incapable of comprehending the grounds on which Nelly was so strongly asserted to have done her duty, or of understanding that not to have wronged her husband in one unpardonable way gave her a claim upon the applause of her fellows. Fortunately, indeed, Frances was defended against all questions on this subject by the possession of that unsuspected trouble of her own, of which she felt that for the night at least it was futile to say anything. Nelly was the only subject upon which her mother could speak, or for which Markham had any ears. They did not say anything, either after Frances left them, or in her presence, of the future, of which no doubt their minds were full, of which Nelly's mind had been so full when she burst into Lady Markham's room in her finery on that very day, of what was to happen after, what the widow, that name against which she so rebelled, but which was already fixed upon her in all the clubs and drawing-rooms, was to do. That was a question which was not openly put to each other by the two persons chiefly concerned. When Markham appeared in his usual haunts that night, he was aware of being regarded with many significant looks, but these he was of course prepared for, and met with a countenance in which it would have puzzled the wisest to find any special expression. Lady Markham went to bed as soon as her son left her. She had said she could receive no one, being much fatigued. "My lady have been with Mrs. Winterbourne," was the answer made to Sir Thomas when he came to the door late, after a tedious debate in the House of Commons. Sir Thomas, like everybody, was full of speculations on this point, though he regarded it from a point of view different from the popular one. The world was occupied with the question whether Nelly would marry Markham, now that she was rich and free. But what occupied Sir Thomas, who had no doubt on this subject, was the afterwards. What would Lady Markham do? Was it not now at last the moment for Waring to come home? In Lady Markham's mind some similar thoughts were afloat. She had said that she was fatigued, but fatigue does not mean sleep, at least not at Lady Markham's age. It means retirement, silence, and leisure for the far more fatiguing exertion of thought. When her maid had been dismissed, and the faint night lamp was all that was left in her curtained, cushioned, luxurious room, the questions that arose in her mind were manifold. Markham's marriage would make a wonderful difference in his mother's life. Her house in Eaton Square she would no doubt retain, but the lovely little house in the Isle of Wight, which had been always hers, and the solemn establishment in the country, would be hers no more. These two things of themselves would make a great difference, but what was of still more consequence was that Markham himself would be hers no more. He would belong to his wife. It was impossible to believe of him that he could ever be otherwise than affectionate and kind, but what a difference when Markham was no longer one of the household! And then the husband, so long cut off, so far separated, much by distance, more by the severance of all the habits and mutual claims which bind people together, with him what would follow? What would be the effect of the change? Questions like these, diversified by perpetual efforts of imagination to bring before her again the tragical scene of which she had been a witness, the dying man with his hoarse attempts to be intelligible, the young, haggard, horrified countenance of Nellie, compelled to approach the awful figure for which she had a child's dread, kept her awake long into the night. It is seldom that a woman of her age sees herself on the eve of such changes without any will of hers. It seemed to have overwhelmed her in a moment, although, indeed, she had foreseen the catastrophe. What would Nellie do? Was the question all the world was asking. But Lady Markham had another which occupied her as much on her own side. Waring, what would he do? End of chapter 41. Recording by Joshua Seeger in Chicago.
Chapter 42 of A House Divided Against Itself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A House Divided Against Itself by Margaret Oliphant. Chapter 42. The question which disturbed Frances, which nobody knew or cared for, was just as little likely to gain attention next day as it had been on the evening of Mr. Winterbourne's death. Lady Markham returned to Nellie before breakfast. She was with her most of the day, and Markham, though he lent an apparent attention to what Frances said to him, was still far too much absorbed in his own subject to be easily moved by hers. "Gaunt? Oh, he is all right," he said. "Will you speak to him, Markham? Will you warn him? Mr. Ramsay says he is losing all his money, and I know, oh, Markham, I know that he has not much to lose." "Claude is a little meddler. I assure you, Fan, Gaunt knows his own affairs best." "No," cried Frances. "When I tell you, Markham, when I tell you that they are quite poor, really poor, not like you. I have told you, my little dear, that I am the poorest beggar in London." "Oh, Markham, and you drive about in hansoms and smoke cigars all day." "Well, my dear, what would you have me do? Keep on trudging through the mud, which would waste all my time, or get on the knife board of an omnibus? Well, these are the only alternatives. The omnibuses have their recommendation. They are fun. But after a while, society in that development palls upon the intelligent observer. What do you want me to do, Fan? Come, I have a deal on my mind, but to please you, and to make you hold your tongue, if there is anything I can do, I will try." "You can do everything, Markham. Warn him that he is wasting his money, that he is spending what belongs to the old people, that he is making himself wretched. Oh, don't laugh, Markham. Oh, if I were in your place, I know what I should do. I would get him to go home, instead of going to those places." "Which places, Fan?" "Oh," cried the girl, exasperated to tears, "how can I tell? The places you know, the places you have taken him to, Markham. Places where, if the poor General knew it, or Mrs. Gaunt—" There you are making a mistake, little Fan. The good people would think their son was in very fine company. If he tells them the names of the persons he meets, they will think—" "Then you know they will think wrong, Markham," she cried, almost with violence, keeping herself with the most strenuous effort from an outburst of indignant weeping. He did not reply at once, and she thought he was about to consider the question on its merits and endeavor to find out what he could do. But she was undeceived when he spoke. "What day did you say, Fan, the funeral was to be?" he asked, with the air of a man who has escaped from an unwelcome intrusion to the real subject of his thoughts. Sir Thomas found her alone, flushed and miserable, drying her tears with a feverish little angry hand. She was very much alone during these days, when Lady Markham was so often with Nellie Winterbourne. Sir Thomas was pleased to find her, having also an object of his own. He soothed her when he saw that she had been crying. "Never mind me," he said, "but you must not let other people see that you are feeling it so much, for you cannot be supposed to take any particular interest in Winterbourne, and people will immediately suppose that you and your mother are troubled about the changes that must take place in the house." "I was not thinking at all of Mrs. Winterbourne," cried Frances, with indignation. "No, my dear, I knew you could not be. Don't let anyone but me see you crying. Lady Markham will feel the marriage dreadfully, I know, but now is our time for our grand coup." "What grand coup?" the girl said, with an astonished look. "Have you forgotten what I said to you at the Priory? One of the chief objects of my life is to bring Waring back. It is intolerable to think that a man of his abilities should be banished forever, and lost not only to his country but his kind, even if he were working for the good of the race out there. But he is doing nothing but antiquities, so far as I can hear, and there are plenty of antiquarians good for nothing else. Frances, we must have him home." "Home," she said. Her heart went back with a bound to the rooms in the palazzo, with all the green persiani shut, and everything dark and cool. It was getting warm in London, but there were no such precautions taken. And the loggia at night, with the palm trees waving majestically their long drooping fans, and the soft sound of the sea coming over the houses of the marina. Ah, and the happy want of thought, the pleasant vacancy in which nothing ever happened. She drew a long breath. "I ought not to say so, perhaps, but when you say home—" "You think of the place where you were brought up? That is quite natural. But it would not be the same to him. He was not brought up there. He can have nothing to interest him there. Depend upon it, he must very often wish that he could pocket his pride and come back. We must try to get him back, Frances. Don't you think, my dear, that we could manage it, you and I?" Frances shook her head and said she did not know. "But I should be very glad, oh, very glad, if I am to stay here," she said. "Of course you would be glad, and of course you are to stay here. You could not leave your poor mother by herself, and now that probably everything will be changed for Markham. If Markham were out of the way it would be so much easier, for you know he always was the stumbling block. She would not let Waring manage him, and she could not manage him herself." Frances was so far instructed in what was going on around her that she knew how important in Markham's history the death of Mr. Winterbourne had been, but it was not a subject on which she could speak. She said, "I am very sorry Papa did not like Markham. It does not seem possible not to like Markham. But I suppose, gentlemen—" "Oh, Sir Thomas, if he were here I would ask Papa to do something for me, but now I don't know who to ask to help me, if anything can be done." "Is it something I can do?" "I think," she said, "anyone that was kind could do it, but only not a girl. Girls are good for so little. Do you remember Captain Gaunt, who came to town a few weeks ago? Sir Thomas, I have heard that something has happened to Captain Gaunt. I don't know how to tell you. Perhaps you will think it is not my business, but don't you think it is your friend's business when you get into trouble? Don't you think that people who know you, who care a little for you, should always be ready to help?" "That is a hard question to put to me. In the abstract, yes, but in particular cases. Is it Captain Gaunt for whom you care a little?" Frances hesitated a moment, and then she answered boldly, "Yes, at least I care for his people a great deal, and he has come home from India not very strong, and he knew nothing about what you call society, no more than I did, and now I hear that he is, I don't know how to tell you, Sir Thomas, losing all his money, and he has not any money, in the places where Markham goes, in the places that Markham took him to. Oh, wait till I have told you everything, Sir Thomas. They are not rich people, not like any of you here. Markham says he is poor." "So he is, Frances." "Ah," she cried with hasty contempt, "but you don't understand. He may not have much money, but they live in a little house with 2 maids and Tony. They have no luxuries or grandeur. When they take a drive in old Luca's carriage, it is something to think about. All that is quite different from you people here. Don't you see, Sir Thomas? Don't you see? And Captain Gaunt has been, oh, I don't know how it is, losing his money, and he has not got any, and he is miserable, and I cannot get anyone to take an interest, to tell him, to warn him, to get him to give up." "Did he tell you all this himself?" said Sir Thomas gravely. "Oh, no, not a word. It was Mr. Ramsay who told me, and when I begged him to say something to warn him, he could not do that. There he was quite right, and you were quite wrong, if you will let me say so. It is too common a case. Alas, I don't know what anyone can do." "Oh, Sir Thomas, if you will think of the old general and his mother who love him more than all the rest, for he is the youngest. Oh, won't you do something, try something to save him?" Frances clasped her hands as if in prayer. She raised her eyes to his face with such an eloquence of entreaty that his heart was touched. Not only was her whole soul in the petition for the sake of him who was in peril, but it was full of boundless confidence and trust in the man to whom she appealed. The other plea might have failed, but this last can scarcely fail to affect the mind of any individual to whom it is addressed. Sir Thomas put his hand on her shoulder with fatherly tenderness. "My dear little girl," he said, "what do you think I can do? I don't know what I can do. I am afraid I should only make things worse were I to interfere." "No, no, he is not like that. He would know you were a friend. He would be thankful. And oh, how thankful I should be." "Frances, do you take then so great an interest in this young man? Do you want me to look after him for your sake?" She looked at him hastily with an eager "Yes," then paused a little and looked again with a dawning understanding which brought the color to her cheek. "You mean something more than I mean," she said, a little troubled. "But yet, if you will be kind to George Gaunt and try to help him for my sake, yes, oh yes, why should I refuse? I would not have asked you if I had not thought that perhaps you would do it for me." "I would do a great deal for you, for your mother's daughter, much, and for poor Waring's child, and again for yourself. But, Frances, a young man who is so weak, who falls into temptation in this way, my dear, you must let me say it, he is not a mate for such as you." "For me? Oh, no! No one ever thought," cried Frances hastily. "Sir Thomas, I hear mamma coming, and I do not want to trouble her, for she has so much to think of. Will you? Oh, promise me, look for him tonight. Oh, look for him tonight." "You are so sure that I can be of use?" The trust in her eyes was so genuine, so enthusiastic, that he could not resist that flattery. "Yes, I will try. I will see what it is possible to do. And you, Frances, remember you are pledged too. You are to do everything you can for me." He was patting her on the shoulder, looking down upon her with very friendly, tender eyes, when Lady Markham came in. She was a little startled by the group, but though she was tired and discomposed and out of heart, she was not so preoccupied but what her quick mind caught a new suggestion from it. Sir Thomas was very rich. He had been devoted to herself in all honor and kindness for many years. What if Frances A whole train of new ideas burst into her mind on the moment, although she had thought, as she came in, that in the present chaos and hurry of her spirits she had room for nothing more. "You look," she said with a smile, "as if you were settling something. What is it? An alliance? A league?" "Offensive and defensive," said Sir Thomas. "We have given each other mutual commissions, and we are great friends, as you see. But these are our little secrets, which we don't mean to tell. How is Nellie, Lady Markham? And is it all right about the will?" "The will is the least of my cares. I could not inquire into that, as you may suppose, nor is there any need, so far as I know. Nellie is quite enough to have on one's hands, without thinking of the will. She is very nervous and very headstrong. She would have rushed away out of the house if I had not used almost force. She cannot bear to be under the same roof with death. It was the old way. I scarcely wonder for my part, for it was never pretended, I suppose, that there was any love in the matter." "Oh, no." Lady Markham looked at her own elderly knight and at her young daughter, and said to herself, "What if Frances—" There was no love, but she has always been very good and done her duty by him. That everybody will say. Poor Nellie, that is quite true. But still I should not like, if I were such a fool as to marry a young wife, to have her do her duty to me in that way." "You would be very different," said Lady Markham with a smile. "I should not think you a fool at all, and I should think her a lucky woman." She said this with Nellie Winterbourne's voice still ringing in her ears. "Happily, I am not going to put it to the test. Now I must go to look after your affairs, Miss Frances, and remember that you are pledged to look after mine in return." Lady Markham looked after him very curiously as he went away. She thought, as women so often think, that men were very strange, inscrutable, mostly fools, at least in one way. To think that perhaps little Frances— it would be a great match, greater than Claude Ramsay, as good in one point of view, and in other respects far better than Nellie St. John's great marriage with the rich Mr. Winterbourne. "I am glad you like him so much, Frances," she said. "He is not young, but he has every other quality, as good as ever man was, and so considerate and kind. You may take him into your confidence fully." She waited a moment to see if the child had anything to say, then, too wise to force or precipitate matters, went on. "Poor Nellie gives me great anxiety, Frances. I wish the funeral were over, and all well. Her nerves are in such an excited state, one can't feel sure what she may do or say. The servants and people happily think it grief, but to see Sarah Winterbourne looking at her fills me with fright. I can't tell why. She doesn't think it is grief, and how should it be? A dreadful, cold, always ill, repulsive man. But I hope she may be kept quiet, not to make a scandal until after the funeral at least. I don't know what she said to you, my love, that day, but you must not pay any attention to what a woman says in such an excited state. Her marriage has been unfortunate, which is a thing that may happen in any circumstances, not because Mr. Winterbourne was such a good match, but because he was such a disagreeable man." Frances, who had no clue to her mother's thoughts, or to any appropriateness in this short speech, had little interest in it. She said, somewhat stiffly, that she was sorry for poor Mrs. Winterbourne, but much more sorry for her own mother, who was having so much trouble and anxiety. Lady Markham smiled upon her and kissed her tenderly. It was a relief to her mind, in the midst of all those anxious questions, to have a new channel for her thoughts, and upon this new path she threw herself forth in the fullness of a lively imagination, leaving fact far behind, and even probability. She was indeed quite conscious of this, and voluntarily permitted herself the pleasant exercise of building a new castle in the air. Little Frances! And she said to herself that there would be no drawback in such a case. It would be the finest match of the season, and no mother need fear to trust her daughter in Sir Thomas's hands. Sir Thomas came back next morning when Lady Markham was again absent. He informed Frances that he had gone to several places where he was told Captain Gaunt was likely to be found, and had seen Markham, as usual, frittering himself away, but Gaunt had nowhere been visible. Someone said he had fallen ill. If that is so, it is the best thing that could happen. One has some hope of getting hold of him so. But where did he live? That was the question. Markham did not know, nor anyone about. That was the first thing to be discovered, Sir Thomas said. For the first time, Frances appreciated her mother's business-like arrangements for her great correspondence, which made an address book so necessary. She found Gaunt's address there, and passed the rest of the day in anxiety, which she could confide to no one, learning for the first time those tortures of suspense which to so many women form a great part of existence. Frances thought the day would never end. It was so much the more dreadful to her that she had to shut it all up in her own bosom, and endeavor to enter into other anxieties, and sympathize with her mother's continual panic as to what Nellie Winterbourne might do. The house altogether was in a state of suppressed excitement. Even the servants, or perhaps the servants most keenly of any, with their quick curiosity and curious divination of any change in the atmosphere of a family, feeling the thrill of approaching revolution. Frances, with her private preoccupation, was blunted to this. But when Sir Thomas arrived in the evening, it was all she could do to curb herself and keep within the limits of ordinary rule. She sprang up, indeed, when she heard his step on the stair, and went off to the further corner of the room, where she could read his face out of the dimness before he spoke, and where perhaps he might seek her and tell her under some pretense. These movements were keenly noted by her mother, as was also the alert air of Sir Thomas, and his interest and activity, though he looked very grave. But Frances did not require to wait for the news she looked for so anxiously. "Yes, I am very serious," Sir Thomas said in answer to Lady Markham's question. "I have news to tell you which will shock you. Your poor young friend Gaunt, Captain Gaunt, wasn't he a friend of yours, is lying dangerously ill of fever in a poor little set of lodgings he has got. He is far too ill to know me or say anything to me, but so far as I can make out, it has something to do with losses at play." Lady Markham turned pale with alarm and horror. "Oh, I have always been afraid of this. I had a presentiment," she cried. Then rallying a little, "But, Sir Thomas, no one thinks now that fever is brought on by mental causes. It must be bad water or defective drainage." "It may be anything. I can't tell. I am no doctor. But the fact is, the young fellow is lying delirious, raving. I heard him myself, about stakes and chances and losses, and how he will make it up tomorrow. There are other things too. He seems to have had hard lines, poor fellow, if all is true." Frances had rushed forward, unable to restrain herself. "Oh, his mother, his mother! We must send for his mother!" she cried. "I will go and see him tomorrow," said Lady Markham. "I had a presentiment. He has been on my mind ever since I saw him first. I blame myself for losing sight of him. But tomorrow, that is what the poor fellow says." End of chapter 42.
Chapter 43 of A House Divided Against Itself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A House Divided Against Itself by Margaret O. Oliphant. Chapter 43. Lady Markham did not forget her promise. Whatever else a great lady may forget in these days, her sick people, her hospitals, she is sure never to forget. She went early to the lodgings, which were not far off, hidden in one of the quaint corners of little old lanes behind Piccadilly, where poor Gaunt was. She did not object to the desire of Frances to go with her, nor to the anxiety she showed. The man was ill. He had become a case. It was natural and right that he should be an object of interest. For herself, so far as Lady Markham's thoughts were free at all, George Gaunt was much more than a case to her. A little while ago, she would have given him a large share in her thoughts, with a remorseful consciousness, almost of a personal part, in the injury which had been done him. But now there were so many other matters in the foreground of her mind that this, though it gave her one sharp twinge and an additional desire to do all that could be done for him, had yet fallen into the background. Besides, things had arrived at a climax. There was no longer any means of delivering him, no further anxiety about his daily movements. There he lay, incapable of further action. It was miserable, yet it was a relief. Markham and Markham's associates had no more power over a sick man. Lady Markham managed her affairs always in a businesslike way. She sent to inquire what was the usual hour of the doctor's visit, and timed her arrival so as to meet him and receive all the information he could give. Even the medical details of the case were not beyond Lady Markham's comprehension. She had a brief but very full consultation with the medical man in the little parlor downstairs, and promptly issued her orders for nurses and all that could possibly be wanted for the patient. 2 nurses at once, one for the day and the other for the night. Ice by the cartload. The street to be covered with hay, any traffic that it was possible to stop, arrested. These directions Frances heard while she sat anxious and trembling in her brougham, and watched the doctor, a humble and undistinguished practitioner of the neighborhood, stirred into excited interest by the sudden appearance of the great lady, with her liberal ideas, upon the scene, hurrying away. Lady Markham then disappeared again into the house, the small, trim, shallow London lodging-house, with a few scrubby plants in the little balconies on the first floor, where the windows were open but veiled by sun-blinds. Something that sounded like incessant talking came from these windows, a sound to which Frances paid no attention at first, thinking it nothing but a conversation, though curiously carried on without break or pause. But after a while, the monotony of the sound gave her a painful sensation. The street was very quiet, even without the hay. Now and then a cart or carriage would come round the corner, taking a short cut from one known locality to another. Sometimes a street cry would echo through the sunshine. A cart full of flowering plants, with a hoarse-voiced proprietor, went along in stages, stopping here and there, but through all ran the strain of talk, monologue, or conversation, never interrupted. The sound affected the girl's nerves, she could not tell why. She opened the door of the brougham at last, and went into the narrow little doorway of the house, where it became more distinct. A persistent, dull strain of speech. All was deserted on the lower floor, the door of the sitting-room standing open, the narrow staircase leading to the sick man's rooms above. Frances felt her interest, her eager curiosity, grow at every moment. She ran lightly, quickly upstairs. The door of the front room, the room with the balconies, was ajar, and now it became evident that the sound was that of a single voice, hoarse, not always articulate, talking. Oh, the weary strain of talk! Monotonous, unending, sometimes rising faintly, sometimes falling lower, never done, without a pause. That could not be raving, Frances said to herself. Oh, not raving. Cries of excitement and passion would have been comprehensible. But there was something more awful in the persistency of the dull, choked voice. She said to herself it was not George Gaunt's voice. She did not know what it was. But as she put forth all these arguments to herself, trembling, she drew ever nearer and nearer to the door. Red, red and red. Stick to my color, my coat, Markham, and the ribbon, her ribbon. I say red. Play, all play. Always amusement. Her ribbon, red. No, not red, black, color, death. No color means nothing, all nothing. Markham, play, gain or lose, all, nothing kept back. Red, I say, and red, blood, color. Mother, no, it's black, no blood, no reproach, death, makes up all death, black, red, black, all death, colors, all death. Then there was a little change in the voice. Constance? India? No, not India. Anywhere. Give up everything. Amusement. Did you say amusement? Don't say so. Sport to you, but death. color of death, black or red, blood, all death, colors, death. Mother, don't put on black, red ribbons like hers, red hearts, blood. No bullet, no. Her little hand, little white hand, and then blood, red. Constance, play, play. Nothing left, play. Frances stood outside and shuddered. Was this, then, what they called raving? She shrank within herself. Her heart failed her. A sickness which took the light from her eyes, made her limbs tremble, and her head swim. Oh, what sport had he been to the two who were nearest to her in the world? What had they done to him, Mrs. Gaunt's boy, the youngest, the favorite? There swept through the girl's mind, like a bitter wind, a cry against fate, was it, or Providence? Had they but let alone, had each stayed in her own place, it would have been Frances who should have met, with a fresh heart, the young man's early fancy. They would have met, sincere and faithful, and loved each other, and all would have been well. But there was no Frances, there was only Constance, to throw his heart away. She seemed to see it all as in a picture. Constance, with the red ribbons on her gray dress, with the smile that said it was only amusement, with the little hand, the little white hand that gave the blow. And then all play, red or black, what did it matter? And the bullet, and the mother in mourning, and Markham. Constance and Markham, murderers. This was the cry that came from the bottom of the girl's heart. Murderers. Of two, of him and of herself, of the happiness that was justly hers, which at this moment she claimed and wildly asserted her right to have, in the clamor of her angry heart. She seemed to see it all in a moment, how he was hers, how she had given her heart to him before she ever saw him, how she could have made him happy. She would not have shrunk from India or anywhere. She would have made him happy. And Constance, for a jest, had come between, for amusement, had broken his heart. And Markham, for amusement, had destroyed his life, and hers as well. There are moments when the gentle and simple mind becomes more terrible than any fury. She saw it all as in a picture, with one clear, sudden revelation, and her heart rose against it with a sensation of wrong which was intolerable, of misery which she could not, would not bear. She pushed open the door, scarcely knowing what she did. The bed was pulled out from the wall, almost into the center of the room, and behind, while this strange, husky monologue of confused passion was going on unnoted, Lady Markham and the landlady stood together talking in calm undertones of the treatment to be employed. Frances's senses, all stimulated to the highest point, took in, without meaning to do so, every particular of the scene and every word that was said. "I can do no good by staying now," Lady Markham was saying. "There's so little to be done at this stage. The ice to his head, that is all till the nurse comes. She will be here before 1 o'clock, and in the meantime, you must watch him carefully, and if anything occurs, let me know. Be very careful to tell me everything, for the slightest symptom is important." "Yes, my lady. I'll take great care, my lady." The woman was overawed yet excited by this unexpected visitor who had turned the dull drama of the lodger's illness into a great, important, and exciting conflict, conducted by the highest officials against disease and death. "As I go home, I shall call at Dr. ——, naming the great doctor of the moment, who will meet the other gentlemen here, and after that, if they decide on ice baths or any other active treatment. But there will be time to think of that. In the meantime, if anything important occurs, communicate with me at once at Eaton Square." "Yes, my lady, I'll not forget nothing. My husband will run in a moment to let your ladyship know." "That will be quite right. Keep him in the house, so that he may get anything that is wanted." Lady Markham gave her orders with the liberality of a woman who had never known any limit to the possibilities of command in this way. She went up to the bed and looked at the patient who lay all unconscious of inspection, continuing the horse talk to which she had ceased to attend, through which she had carried on her conversation in complete calm. She touched his forehead for a moment with the back of her ungloved hand and shook her head. "The temperature is very high," she said. There was a semi-professional calm in all she did. Now that he was under treatment, he could be considered dispassionately as a case. When she turned round and saw Frances within the door, She held up her finger. "Look at him if you wish, for a moment, poor fellow, but not a word," she said. Frances, from the passion of anguish and wrong which had seized upon her, sank altogether into a confused hush of semi-remorseful feeling. Her mother, at least, was occupied with nothing that was not for his good. "I told you that I mistrusted Markham," she said, as they drove away. "He did not mean any harm, but that is his life. And I think I told you that I was afraid Constance— Oh, my dear, a mother has a great many hard offices to undertake in her life, to make up for things which her children may have done. And gaîté de cœur, without a thought." "Gaîté de cœur? Is that what you call it?" cried Frances. "When you murder a man?" Her voice was choked with the passion that filled her. "Frances! Murder! You are the last one in the world from whom I should have expected anything violent." "Oh!" cried the girl, flushed and wild, her eyes gleaming through an angry dew of pain. "What word is there that is violent enough? He was happy and good, and there might have been people who could have loved him and made him happy. When one comes in, one who had no business there, one who, and takes him from the others, and makes a sport of him, and a toy to amuse herself, and flings him broken away. It is worse than murder, if there's anything worse than murder," she cried. Lady Markham could not have been more astonished if some passer-by had presented a pistol at her head. "Frances!" she cried, and took the girl's hot hands into her own, endeavoring to soothe her. "You speak as if she meant to do it, as if she had some interest in doing it. Frances, you must be just." "If I were just, if I had the power to be just, is there any punishment which could be great enough? His life? But it is more than his life. It is misery and torture and wretchedness to him first, and then to his mother, to—" She ended as a woman, as a poor little girl, scarcely yet woman-grown, must, in an agony of tears. All that a tender mother and that a kind woman could do, with due regard to the important business in her hands, and a glance aside to see that the coachman did not mistake Sir Joseph's much-frequented door, Lady Markham did to quench this extraordinary passion and bring back calm to Frances. She succeeded so far that the girl, hurriedly drying her tears, retiring with shame and confusion into herself, recovered sufficient self-command to refrain from further betrayal of her feelings. In the midst of it all, though she was not unmoved by her mother's tenderness, she had a kind of fierce perception of Lady Markham's anxiety about Sir Joseph's door, and her eagerness not to lose any time in conveying her message to him, which she did rapidly in her own person, putting the footman aside, corrupting somehow by sweet words and looks the incorruptible functionary who guarded the great doctor's door. It was all for poor Gaunt's sake, and done with care for him, as anxious and urgent as if he had been her own son, and yet it was business, too, which, had Frances been in a mood to see the humor of it, might have lightened the tension of her feelings. But she was in no mind for humor, a thing which passion has never any eyes for, or cognizance of. "That is all quite right. He will meet the other doctor this afternoon, and we may be now comfortable that he is in the best hands," Lady Markham said, with a sigh of satisfaction. She added, "I suppose, of course, his parents will not hesitate about the expense?" in a faintly inquiring tone, but did not insist on any reply, nor could Frances have given any reply. But amid the chaos of her mind there came a consciousness of poor Mrs. Gaunt's dismay, could she have known. She would have watched her son night and day, and there was not one of the little community at Bordighera, Mrs. Durrant with all her little pretences, Taisy with her airs of young ladyhood, who would not have shared the vigil. But the two expensive nurses, with every accessory that new-fangled science could think of, this would have frightened out of their senses the two poor parents who would not hesitate about the expense, or any expense that involved their son's life. In this point, too, the different classes could not understand each other. The idea flew through the girl's mind with a half-despairing consciousness that this, too, had something to do with the overwhelming revolution in her own circumstances. A man of her own species would have understood Constance. He would have known Markham's reputation and ways. The pot of iron and the pot of clay could not travel together without damage to the weakest. This went vaguely through Frances's mind in the middle of her excitement, and perhaps helped to calm her. It also stilled, if it did not calm her, to see that her mother was a little afraid of her in her new development. Lady Markham, when she returned to the brougham after her visit to Sir Joseph, manifestly avoided the subject. She was careful not to say anything of Markham or of Constance. Her manner was anxious, deprecatory, full of conciliation. She advised Frances with much tenderness to go and rest a little when they got home. "I fear you have been doing too much, my darling," she cried, and followed her to her room with some potion and a glass. "I am quite well," Frances said. "There is nothing the matter with me. But I am sure, my dearest, that you are overdone." Her anxious and conciliatory looks were of themselves a tonic to Frances, and brought her back to herself. Markham, when he appeared in the evening, showed unusual feeling too. He was at the crisis, it seemed, of his own life, and perhaps other sentiments had therefore an easier hold upon him. He came in looking very downcast, with none of his usual banter in him. "Yes, I know. I have heard all about it, bless you. What else, do you think, are those fellows talking about? Poor beggar. Whoever thought he'd have gone down like that in so short a time? Now, mother, the only thing wanting is that you should say, 'I told you so.' And Fan can do worse. She can tell me that she thought he was safe in my hands. It is not my way to say 'I told you so,' Markham, but yet—" "You could do it, mammy, if you tried. That is well known. I'm rather glad he is ill, poor beggar. It stops the business. But there are things to pay. That is the worst." "Surely, if it is to a gentleman, he will forgive him," cried Frances, "when he knows—" "Forgive him? Poor Gaunt would rather die. It would be as much as a man's life was worth to offer to forgive another man. But how should the child know? That's the beauty of society and the rules of honor, Fan. You can forgive a man many things, but not a shilling you've won from him. And how is he to mend good life with the thought of having to pay up in the end?" Markham repeated this despondent speech several times before he went gloomily away. "I had rather die straight off and make no fuss. But even then, he'd have to pay up, or somebody for him. If I had known what I know now, I'd have eaten him sooner than have taken him among those fellows who have no mercy. Markham, if you would listen to me, you would give them up, you too. Oh, he said with his short laugh, "they can't do much to harm me. But you must change, in that as well as other things, if, he said, with a curious grimace, and took up his hat and went away. Thus, Frances said to herself, his momentary penitence and her mother's pity melted away in consideration of themselves. They could not say a dozen words on any other subject, even such an urgent one as this, before their attention dropped and they relapsed into the former question about themselves. And such a question! Markham's marriage, which depended on Nellie Winterbourne's widowhood and the portion her rich husband left her. Markham was an English peer, the head of a family which had been known for centuries, which even had touched the history of England here and there. Yet this was the ignoble way in which he was to take the most individual step of a man's life. Her heart was full almost to bursting of these questions, which had been gradually awakening in her mind. Lady Markham, when left alone, turned always to the consolation of her correspondence, of those letters to write which filled up all the interstices of her other occupations. Perhaps she was specially glad to take refuge in this assumed duty, having no desire to enter again with her daughter into any discussion of the events of the day. Frances withdrew into a distant corner. She took a book with her and did her best to read it, feeling that anything was better than to allow herself to think, to summon up again the sound of that hoarse, broken voice running on in the feverish current of disturbed thought. Was he still talking, God help him, of death and blood and the two colors and her ribbon and the misery which was all play? Oh, the misery, causeless, unnecessary, to no good purpose, that had come merely from this, that Constance had put herself in Frances's place, that the pot of iron had thrust itself in the road of the pot of clay. But she must not think, the girl said to herself with feverish earnestness, and tried the book again. Finding it of no avail, however, she put it down, and left her corner, and came, in a moment of leisure, between two letters, behind her mother's chair. "May I ask you a question, mamma?" "As many as you please, my dear." But Lady Markham's face bore a harassed look. "You know, Frances, there are some to which there is no answer, which I can only ask with an aching heart like yourself," she said. "This is a very simple one. It is, have I any money? of my own?" Lady Markham turned round on her chair and looked at her daughter. "Money," she said. "Are you in need of anything? Do you want money, Frances? I shall never forgive myself if you have felt yourself neglected. It is not that. I mean, have I anything of my own?" After a little pause, "There is a small provision made for you by my marriage settlement," Lady Markham said. "And, once more, could I have it, Mamma?" "My dear child, you must be out of your senses. How could you have it at your age, unless you were going to marry?" This suggestion Frances rejected with the contempt it merited. "I shall never marry," she said, "and there never could be a time when it would be of so much importance to me to have it as now. Oh, tell me, is there no way by which I could have it now? Sir Thomas is one of our trustees. Ask him. I do not think he will let you have it, Frances. But perhaps you could tell him what you want, if you will not have confidence in me. Money is just the thing that is least easy for me. I could give you almost anything else, but money I have not. What can you want money for, a girl like you?" Frances hesitated before she replied. "I would rather not tell you," she said, "for very likely you would not approve. But it is nothing wrong." "You are very honest, my dear. I do not suppose for a moment it is anything wrong. Ask Sir Thomas," Lady Markham said with a smile. The smile had meaning in it which to Frances was incomprehensible. "Sir Thomas will refuse nothing he can in reason give. Of that I am sure." Sir Thomas, when he came in shortly afterwards, said that he would not disturb Lady Markham. "For I see you are busy, and I have something to say to Frances." "Who has also something to say to you," Lady Markham said with a benignant smile. Her heart gave a throb of satisfaction. It was all she could do to restrain herself, not to tell the dear friend to whom she was writing that there was every prospect of a most happy establishment for dear Frances. And her joy was quite genuine and almost innocent, notwithstanding all she knew. "You have written to your father?" Sir Thomas said. "My dear Frances, I have got the most hopeful letter from him, the first I have had for years. He asks me if I know what state Hillborough is in, if it is habitable. That looks like coming home, don't you think? And it is years since he has written to me before." Frances did not know what Hillborough was, but she disliked showing her ignorance, and this idea was not so comforting to her as Sir Thomas expected. She said, "I do not think he will come," with downcast eyes. But Sir Thomas was strong in his own way of thinking. He was excited and pleased by the letter. He told her again and again how he had desired this, how happy it made him to think he was about to be successful at last. And just at the moment when all is likely to be arranged, when Markham— "You have brought me luck, Frances. Now tell me, what is it you wanted from me?" Frances's spirits had fallen lower and lower while his rose. Her mind ranged over the new possibilities with something like despair. It would be Constance, not she, who would have done it, if he came back. Constance, who had taken her place from her, the love that ought to have been hers, her father, and who now, on her return, would resume her place with her mother too. Ah, what would Constance do? Would she do anything for him who lay yonder in the fever, for his father and his mother, poor old people, anything to make up for the harm she had done? Her heart burned in her agitated, troubled bosom. "It is nothing," she said, "nothing that you would do for me. I had a great wish, but I know you would not let me do it, neither you nor my mother. Tell me what it is, and we shall see." Frances felt her voice die away in her throat. "We went this morning to see— "You mean poor Gaunt. It is a sad sight and a sad story, too sad for a young creature like you to be mixed up in." "Is it anything for him that you want me to do?" She looked at him through those hot, gathering tears which interrupt the vision of women, and blind them when they most desire to see clearly. A sense of the folly of her hope, of the impossibility of making anyone understand what was in her mind, overwhelmed her. I cannot, she cried. "Oh, I know you are very kind. I wanted my own money, if I have any, but I know you will not give it to me, nor think it right, nor understand what I want to do with it." "Have you so little trust in me?" said Sir Thomas. "I hope, if you told me, I could understand. I cannot give you your own money, Frances, but if it were for a good— no, I will not say that— for a sensible, for a practical purpose, you should have some of mine." "Yours!" she cried almost with indignation. "Oh no, that is not what I mean. They are nothing, nothing to you." She paused when she had said this and grew very pale. "I did not mean— Sir Thomas, please do not say anything to Mamma." He took her hand affectionately between his own. "I do not half understand," he said, "but I will keep your secret, so far as I know it, my poor little girl." Lady Markham, at her writing table, with her back turned, went on with her correspondence all the time in high satisfaction and pleasure, saying to herself that it would be far better than Nellie Winterbourne's, that it would be the finest match of the year. End of chapter 43. Recording by Kat Andrews. Chapter 44 of A House Divided Against Itself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A House Divided Against Itself by Margaret O. Oliphant. Chapter 44. It had seemed to Frances, as it appears naturally to all who have little experience, that a man who was so ill as Captain Gaunt must get better or get worse without any of the lingering suspense which accompanies a less violent complaint. But naturally, Lady Markham was wiser, and entertained no such delusions. When it had gone on for a week, it already seemed to Frances as if he had been ill for a year, as if there never had been any subject of interest in the world but the lingering course of the malady, which waxed from less to more, from days of quiet to hours of active delirium. The business-like nurses, always so cool and calm, with their professional reports, gave the foolish girl a chill to her heart, thinking, as she did, of the anxiety that would have filled not the house alone in which he lay, but all the little community, had he been ill at home. Perhaps it was better for him that he was not ill at home, that the changes in his state were watched by clear eyes, not made dim by tears or over-sharp by anxiety, but which took him very calmly as a case interesting, no doubt, but only in a scientific sense. After a few days, Lady Markham herself wrote to his mother a very kind letter, full of detail, describing everything which she had done, and how she had taken Captain Gaunt entirely into her own hands. "I thought it better not to lose any time," she said, "and you may assure yourself that everything has been done for him that could have been done, had you yourself been here. I have acted exactly as I should have done for my own son in the circumstances." And she proceeded to explain the treatment in a manner which was far too full of knowledge for poor Mrs. Gaunt's understanding, who could scarcely read the letter for tears. The best nurses, the best doctor, the most anxious care, Lady Markham's own personal supervision, so that nothing should be neglected. The two old parents held their little council over this letter with full hearts. It had been Mrs. Gaunt's first intention to start at once, to get to her boy as fast as express trains could carry her. But then they began to look at each other, to falter forth broken words about expense. 2 nurses, the best doctor in London, and then the mother's rapid journey, the old general left alone. How was she to do it, so anxious, so unaccustomed as she was? They decided, with many doubts and terrors, with great self-denial, and many a sick flutter of questionings as to which was best, to remain. Lady Markham had promised them news every day of their boy, and a telegram at once if there was any change. Those awful words that slay the very soul. Even the poor mother decided that in these circumstances it would be self-indulgence to go, and from henceforward the old people lived upon the post hours, lived in awful anticipation of a telegram announcing a change. Frances was their daily correspondent. She had gone to look at him, she always said, though the nurses would not permit her to stay. He was no worse, but till another week there could be no change. Then she would write that the critical day had passed, that there was still no change, and would not be again for a week, but that he was no worse. No worse! This was the poor fare upon which General Gaunt and his wife lived in their little Swiss pension, where it was so cheap. They gave up even their additional candle, and economized that poor little bit of expenditure. They gave up their wine. They made none of the little excursions which had been their delight. Even with all these economies, How were they to provide the expenses which were running on, the dear London lodgings, the nurses, the boundless outgoings, which it was understood they would not grudge? Grudge! No, not all the money in the world, if it could save their George. But where were they going to get this money? Whence was it to come? This Frances knew, but no one else. And she too knew that the lodgings and the nurses and the doctors were so far from being all. The poor girl spent the days, much as they did, in agonized questions and considerations. If she could but get her money, her own money, whatever it was, later, for her own use, what would it matter? She could work, she could take care of children. It did not matter what she did. But to save him, to save them. She had learned so much, however, about life and the world in which she lived as to know that, were her object known, it would be treated as the supremest folly. Wild ideas of Jews, of finding somebody who would lend her what she wanted, as young men do in novels, rose in her mind, and were dismissed and returned again. But she was not a young man. She was only a girl and knew not what to do, nor where to go. Not even the very alphabet of such knowledge was hers. While this was going on, she was taken, all abstracted as she was, into society, to the solemn heaviness of dinner parties, to dances even, in which her gravity and self-absorption were construed to mean very different things. Lady Markham had never said a word to any one of the idea which had sprung into her own mind full grown at the sight of Sir Thomas holding in fatherly kindness her little girl's hands. She had never said a word, oh, not a word. How such a wild and extraordinary rumor had got about, she could not imagine. But the ways of society and its modes of information are inscrutable. A glance, a smile, are enough. And what so natural as this, to bring a veil of gravity over even a debutante in her first season? Lucky little girl, some people said. Poor little thing, some others. No wonder she was so serious, and her mother, that successful general, her mother, that triumphant matchmaker, radiant in spite, people said, of the very uncomfortable state of affairs about Markham, and the fact that, in the absence of the executor, Nellie Winterbourne knew nothing as yet as to how she was left. Thus, the weeks went past in great suspense for all. Markham had recovered, it need scarcely be said, from his fit of remorse, and he perhaps was the one to whom these uncertainties were a relief rather than an oppression. Mrs. Winterbourne had retired into the country to await the arrival of the all-important functionary who had possession of her husband's will, and to pass decorously the first profundity of her mourning. Naturally, society knew everything about Nellie, how, under the infliction of Sarah Winterbourne's society, she was quite as well as could be expected, how she was behaving herself beautifully in her retirement, seeing nobody, doing just what it was right to do. Nellie had always managed to retain the approval of society, whatever she did. In the best circles, it was now a subject of indignant remark that Sarah Winterbourne should take it upon herself to keep watch like a dragon over the window. For Nellie's provision was right, and the widow was what the men now called her, though women are not addicted to that form of nomenclature. But Sarah Winterbourne was universally condemned. Now that the poor girl had completed her time of bondage and conducted herself so perfectly, why could not that dragon leave her alone? Markham had made no remark upon the subject, but his mother, who understood him so well, believed he was glad that Sarah Winterbourne should be there, making all visits unseemly. Lady Markham thought he was glad of the pause altogether, of the impossibility of doing anything, and to be allowed to go on without any disturbance in his usual way. She had made herself one visit to Nellie, and reported, when she came home, that notwithstanding the presence of Sarah, Nellie's natural brightness was beginning to appear, and that soon she would be as a Spiegel as ever. That was Lady Markham's view of the subject, and there was no doubt that she spoke with perfect knowledge. It was very surprising, according to the ladies, when some days after this, Lady Markham's butler came upstairs to say that Mrs. Winterbourne was at the door, and had sent to inquire whether his mistress was at home and alone before coming upstairs. "Of course I am at home," said Lady Markham. "I am always at home to Mrs. Winterbourne." but to no one else, remember, while she is here." When the man went away with his message, Lady Markham had a moment of hesitation. "You may stay," she said to Frances, "as you were present before and saw her in her trouble. But I wonder what has brought her to town. She did not intend to come to town till the end of the season. She must have something to tell me." "Oh, Nellie, how are you, dear?" she cried, going forward and taking the young widow into her arms. Nellie was in crape from top to toe. As she had always done what was right, what people expected from her, she continued to do so till the end. A little rim of white was under the edge of her close black bonnet with its long veil. Her cuffs were white and hem-stitched in the old-fashioned deep way. Nothing, in short, could be more deep than Nellie's costume altogether. She was a very pattern for widows, and it was very becoming, as that dress seldom fails to be. It would have been natural to expect in Nellie's countenance some consciousness of this, as well as perhaps a something at the corners of her mouth which should show that, as Lady Markham said, she would soon be as a Spiegel as ever. But there was nothing of this in her face. She seemed to have stiffened with her crape. She suffered Lady Markham's embrace rather than returned it. She did not take any notice of Frances. She walked across the room, sweeping with her long dress, with her long veil like an ensign of woe, and sat down with her back to the light. But for a minute or more she said nothing, and listened to Lady Markham's questions without even a movement in reply. "What is the matter, my dear? Is it something you have to tell me, or have you only got tired of the country?" Lady Markham said, with a look of alarm beginning to appear in her face. "I am tired of the country," said Mrs. Winterbourne, "but I am also tired of everything else, so that does not matter much. Lady Markham, I have come to tell you a great piece of news. My trustee and Mr. Winterbourne's executor, who has been at the other end of the world, has come home." "Yes, Nellie?" Lady Markham's look of alarm grew more and more marked. "You make me very anxious," she cried. "I am sure something has happened that you did not foresee." "Oh, nothing has happened that I ought not to have foreseen. I always wondered why Sarah Winterbourne stuck to me so. The will has been opened and read, and I know how it all is now. I rushed to tell you, as you have been so kind." "Dear Nellie," Lady Markham said, not knowing, in the growing perturbation of her mind, what else to say. "Mr. Winterbourne has been very liberal to me. He has left me everything he can leave away from his heir-at-law. Nothing that is entailed, of course, but there is not very much under the entail. They tell me I will be one of the richest women, a wealthy widow. My dear Nellie, I am so very glad, but I am not surprised. Mr. Winterbourne had a great sense of justice. He could not do less for you than that." "But, Lady Markham, you have not heard it all." It was not like Nellie Winterbourne to speak in such measured tones. There was not the faintest sign of the Spiegel in her voice. Frances, roused by the astonished, alarmed look in her mother's face, drew a little nearer almost involuntarily, notwithstanding her abstraction in anxieties of her own. "Nellie, do you mind Frances being here?" "Oh, I wish her to be here. It will do her good. If she is going to do the same as I did, she ought to know." She made a pause again, Lady Markham meanwhile growing pale with fright and panic, although she did not know what there could be to fear. "There are some people who had begun to think that I was not so well left as was expected," she said, "but they were mistaken. I am very well left. I am to have the house in Grosvenor Square, and the Knoll, and all the plate and carriages, and 3 parts or so of Mr. Winterbourne's fortune, so long as I remain Mr. Winterbourne's widow. He was, as you say, a just man." There was a pause. But for something in the air which tingled after Nellie's voice had ceased, the listeners would scarcely have been conscious that anything more than ordinary had been said. Lady Markham said, "Nellie?" in a breathless, interrogative tone, alarmed by that thrill in the air rather than by the words, which were so simple in their sound. "Oh, yes, he had a great sense of justice. So long as I remain Mrs. Winterbourne, I am to have all that. It was his, and I was his, and the property is to be kept together. Don't you see, Lady Markham? Sarah knew it, and I might have known, had I thought. He had a great respect for the name of Winterbourne, not much, perhaps, for anything else. She paused a little, then added, "That's all. I wished you to know." "Oh, my dear," cried Lady Markham, "is it possible? Is it possible? You, debarred from marrying, debarred from everything, at your age?" "Oh, I can do anything I please," cried Nellie. "I can go to the bad if I please. He does not say so long as I behave myself. Only so long as I remain the widow Winterbourne. I told you they would all call me so. Well, they can do it. That's what I am to be all my life, the widow Winterbourne." "Nellie, oh, Nellie," cried Lady Markham, throwing her arms around her visitor. "Oh, my poor child! And how am I to tell—" "You can tell everybody, if you please," said Mrs. Winterbourne, freeing herself from the clasping arms and rising up in her stiff crape. "He had a great sense of justice. He doesn't say I'm to wear weeds all my life. I think I mean to come back to Grosvenor Square on Monday, and perhaps give a ball or two, and some dinners, to celebrate. For I have come into my fortune, don't you see?" she said with an unmoved face. "Hush, dear, hush. You must not talk like that," Lady Markham said, holding her arm. "Why not? Justice is justice, whether for him or me. I was such a fool as to be wretched when he was dying, but it appears that there was no love lost, no love and no faith lost. He did not believe in me any more than I believed in him. I outwitted him when he was living, and he outwits me when he is dead. Do you hear, Francis? That is how things go. If you do as I did, as I hear you are going to do, oh, do it if you please. I will never interfere. But make up your mind to this. He will have his revenge on you, or justice. It is all the same thing. Good-bye, Lady Markham. I hope you will countenance me at my first ball. For now I have come into my fortune, I mean to enjoy myself. Don't you think these things are rather becoming? I mean to wear them out. They will make a sensation at my parties," she said, and for the first time laughed aloud. "This is just the first wounded feeling," said Lady Markham. "Oh, Nellie, you must not fly in the face of society. You have always been so good. No, no, let us think it over. Perhaps we can find a way out of it. There's bound to be a flaw somewhere. Goodbye," said Nellie. "I have not fixed on the day for my first at home, but the invitations will be out directly. Goodbye, Francis. You must come, and Sir Thomas. It will be a fine lesson for Sir Thomas." She walked across the room to the door, and there stood for a moment looking back. She looked taller, almost grand, in still fury and despair, with her immovable face. But as she stood there, a faint softening came to the marble. "Tell Jeff," gently, she said, and went away. They could hear the soft sweep of her black robes retiring down the stair, and then the door opening, the clang of the carriage. Lady Markham had dropped into a chair in her dismay, and sat with her hands clasped and her eyes wide open, listening to these sounds as if they might throw some light on the situation. The consequences which might follow from Nellie's freedom had been heavy on her heart, and it was possible that by and by the strange news might bring the usual comfort. But in the meantime, consternation overwhelmed her. "As long as she remains his widow?" she said to herself in a tone of horror, as the tension of her nerves yielded and the carriage drove away. "And how am I to tell him? Gently. How am I to tell him gently?" she cried. It was as if a great catastrophe had overwhelmed the house. In an hour or so, however, Lady Markham recovered her energy, and began to think whether there might be any way out of it. "I'll tell you," she cried suddenly. "There is your Uncle Clarendon, Francis. He is a great lawyer. If any man can find a flaw in the will, he will do it." She rang the bell at once and ordered the carriage. "But, oh dear," she said, "I forgot. Lady Meliora is coming, about Trotter's Buildings, the place in Whitechapel. I cannot go. Whatever may happen, I cannot go today. But, my dear, you have never taken any part as yet. You need not stay for this meeting, and besides, you are a favorite in Portland Place. You are the best person to go. You can tell your Uncle Clarendon—" "Stop, I will write a note," Lady Markham cried. That was always the most satisfactory plan in every case. She sent her daughter to get ready to go out, and she herself dashed off in 2 minutes 4 sheets of the clearest statement a précis of the whole case. Mr. Clarendon, like most people, liked Lady Markham. He did not share his wife's prejudices, and Frances was a favorite. Surely, moved by these 2 influences combined, he would bestir himself and find a flaw in the will. In less than half an hour from the time of Mrs. Winterbourne's departure, Frances found herself alone in the brougham, going towards Portland Place. Her mind was not absorbed in Nellie Winterbourne. She was not old enough or sufficiently used to the ways of society to appreciate the tragedy in this case. Nellie's horror at the moment of her husband's death she had understood, but Nellie's tragic solemnity now struck her as with a jarring note. Indeed, Frances had never learned to think of money as she ought, and yet how anxious she was about money. How her thoughts returned, as soon as she felt herself alone and free to pursue them, to the question which devoured her heart. It was a relief to her to be thus free, thus alone and silent, that she might think of it. If she could but have driven on and on for 100 miles or so, to think of it, to find a solution for her problem. But even a single mile was something, for before she had got through the long line of Piccadilly, a sudden inspiration came to her mind. The one person in the world whom she could ask for help was the person whom she was on her way to see, her Aunt Clarendon, who was rich, with whom she was a favorite, who was on the other side ready to sympathize with all that belonged to the life of Bordighera, in opposition to Eaton Square. Nellie Winterbourne and her troubles fled like shadows from Frances's mind. To be truly disinterested, to be always mindful of other people's interests, it is well to have as few as possible of one's own. Mrs. Clarendon received her, as always, with a sort of combative tenderness, as if in competition for her favor with some powerful adversary unseen. There was in her a constant readiness to outbid that adversary, to offer more than she did, of which Frances was usually uncomfortably conscious, but which today stimulated her like a cordial. "I suppose you are being taken to all sorts of places?" she said. "I wish I had not given up society so much. But when the season is over, and the fine people are all in the country, then you will see that we have not forgotten you. Has Sir Thomas come with you, Frances? I suppose, perhaps, you had come to tell me—" "Sir Thomas?" Frances said with much surprise. But she was too much occupied with concerns more interesting to ask what her aunt could mean. "Oh, Aunt Caroline," she said, "I have come to speak to you of something I am very, very much interested about." In all sincerity, she had forgotten the original scope of her mission, and only remembered her own anxiety. And then she told her story, how Captain Gaunt, the son of her old friend, the youngest, the one that was best beloved, had come to town, how he had made friends who were not nice, who made him play and lose money, though he had no money. "Of course, my dear, I know. Lord Markham and his set." At this, Frances colored high. "It was not Markham. Markham has found out for me. It was some fellows who had no mercy," he said. "Oh, yes, they are all the same set. I am very sorry that an innocent girl like you should be in any way mixed up with such people. Whether Lord Markham plucks the pigeon himself, or gets some of his friends to do it. Aunt Caroline, now you take away my last hope, for Markham is my brother, and I will never, never ask anyone to help me who speaks so of my brother. He is always so kind to me." "I don't see what opportunity he has ever had to be kind to you," said Mrs. Clarendon. But Frances, in her disappointment, would not listen. She turned away her head to get rid, so far as was possible, of the blinding tears, those tears which would come in spite of her, notwithstanding all the efforts she could make. "I had a little hope in you," Frances said, "but now I have none. My mother sees him every day. If he lives, she will have saved his life. But I cannot ask her for what I want. I cannot ask her for more. She has done so much. And now You make it impossible for me to ask you." If Frances had studied how to move her aunt best, she could not have hit upon a more effectual way. "My dear child," cried Mrs. Clarendon, hurrying to her, drawing her into her arms. "What is it? What is it that moves you so much? Of whom are you speaking? His life? Whose life is in danger? And what is it you want? If you think I, your father's only sister, will do less for you than Lady Markham does, tell me, my dear, tell me what it is you want." Then Frances continued her story, how young Gaunt was ill of a brain fever, and raved about his losses, and the black and red, and of his mother in mourning. With an additional ache in her heart, Frances suppressed all mention of Constance, and how she understood, though nobody else did, that the Gaunts were not rich, that even the illness itself would tax all their resources, and that the money, the debts to pay, would ruin them and break their hearts. "I don't say he has not been wrong, Aunt Caroline. Oh, I suppose he has been very wrong. But there he is lying, and oh, how pitiful it is to hear him. And the old general, who was so proud of him, and Mrs. Gaunt, dear Mrs. Gaunt, who always was so good to me. Frances, my child, I am not a hard-hearted woman, though you seem to think so. I can understand all that. I am very, very sorry for the poor mother, and for the young man even, who has been led astray. But I don't see what you can do." "What?" cried Frances, her eyes flashing through her tears. "For their son, who is the same as a brother? For them whom I have always known, who have helped to bring me up? Oh, you don't know how people live where there are only a few of them, where there is no society, if you say that. If he had been ill there, at home, we should all have nursed him, every one. We should have thought of nothing else. We would have cooked for him, or gone errands, or done anything. Perhaps those ladies are better who go to the hospitals. But to tell me that you don't know what I could do—" "Oh," cried the girl, springing to her feet, throwing up her hands, "if I had the money, if I only had the money, I know what I would do." Mrs. Clarendon was a woman who did not spend money, who had everything she wanted, who thought little of what wealth could procure. But she was a Quixote in her heart, as so many women are where great things are in question, though not in small. "Money," she said, with a faint quiver of alarm in her voice. "My dear, if it was anything that was feasible, anything that was right, and you wanted it very much, the money might be found," she said. The position, however, was too strange to be mastered in a moment, and difficulties rose as she spoke. A young man, people might suppose, and then Sir Thomas. What would Sir Thomas think? That is why I came to you, for he will not give me my own money, if I have any money. Aunt Caroline, if you will give it to me now, I will pay you back as soon as I am of age. Oh, I don't want to take it from you. I want, if everything could be paid before he is better, before he knows. If we could hide it so that the general and his mother should never find out. That would be worst of all if they were to find out. It would break their hearts. Oh, Aunt Caroline, she thinks there is no one like him. She loves him so, more than anyone here loves anybody, and to find out all that would break her heart." Mrs. Clarendon rose at this moment and stood up with her face turned towards the door. "I can't tell what is the matter with me," she said. "I can scarcely hear what you are saying. I wonder if I'm going to be ill, or what it is. I thought just then I heard a voice. Surely there is someone at the door. I am sure I heard a voice. Oh, a voice you ought to know, if it was true. Frances, I will think of all that after. Just now. He must be dead, or else he is here." Frances, who thought of no possibility of death save to one, caught her aunt's arm with a cry. The great house was very still. Soft carpets everywhere, the distant sound of a closing door scarcely penetrating from below. Yet there was something, that faint human stir which is more subtle than sound. They stood and waited, the elder woman penetrated by sudden excitement and alarm. She could not tell why. the girl indifferent, yet ready for any wonder in the susceptibility of her anxious state. As they stood, not knowing what they expected, the door opened slowly, and there suddenly stood in the opening, like two people in a dream, Constance, smiling, drawing after her a taller figure. Frances, with a start of amazement, threw from her aunt's arm, which she held, and calling, "Father!" flung herself into Waring's arms. End of chapter 44. Recording by Kat Andrews.
Chapter 45 of A House Divided Against Itself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona. A House Divided Against Itself by Margaret O. Oliphant, Chapter 45. I found him in the mood, so I thought it best to strike while the iron was hot, Constance said. She had settled down languidly in a favorite corner, as if she had never been away. She had looked for the footstool where she knew it was to be found, and arranged the cushion as she liked it. Frances had never made herself so much at home as Constance did at once. She looked on with calm amusement while her aunt poured out her delight, her wonder, her satisfaction, in Waring's ears. She did not budge herself from her comfortable place, but she said to Frances in an undertone, "Don't let her go on too long. She will bore him, you know, and then he will repent, and I don't want him to repent." As for Frances, she saw the ground cut away entirely from under her feet, and stood sick and giddy after the first pleasure of seeing her father was over, feeling her hopes all tumble about her. Mrs. Clarendon, who had been so near yielding, so much disposed to give her the help she wanted, had forgotten her petition and her altogether in the unexpected delight of seeing her brother. And here was Constance, the sight of whom might perhaps call the sick man out of his fever, who might restore life and everything, even happiness to him, if she would. But would she? Frances asked herself. Most likely she would do nothing, and there would be no longer any room left for Frances, who was ready to do all. She would have been more than mortal if she had not looked with a certain bitterness at this new and wonderful aspect of affairs. "I saw Mamma's brougham at the door," Constance said. "You must take me home. Of course, this was the place for Papa to come, but I must go home. It would never do to let Mamma think me devoid of feeling. How is she, and Markham, and everybody? I have scarcely had any news for 3 months. We met Algy Muncastle on the boat, and he told us some things, a great deal about Nellie Winterbourne, the widow, as they call her, and about you. There could be nothing to say of me." "Oh, but there was, though. What a sly little thing you are, never to say a word. Sir Thomas." "Ah, you see I know, and I congratulate you with all my heart, Fan. He is rolling in money, and such a good, kind old man. Why, he was a lover of Mamma's dans les temps. It is delightful to think of you consoling him, and you will be as rich as a little princess, with Mamma to see that all the settlements are right." "I don't know what you mean," Frances said abruptly. She was so preoccupied and so impatient that she would not even allow herself to inquire. She went to where her father sat talking to his sister, and stood behind his chair, putting her hand upon his arm. He did not, perhaps, care for her very much. He had Aunt Caroline to think of, from whom he had been separated so long, and Constance, no doubt, had made him her own too, as she had made everybody else her own. But still he was all that Frances had, the nearest, the one that belonged to her most. To touch him like this gave her a little consolation, and he turned round and smiled at her and put his hand upon hers. That was a little comfort too, but it did not last long. It was time she should return to her mother, and Constance was anxious to go, notwithstanding her fear that her father might be bored. "I must go and see my mother, you know, Papa. It would be very disrespectful not to go, and you won't want me, now you have got Aunt Caroline. Frances was going to drive me home." She said this as if it was her sister's desire to go, but as a matter of fact, she had taken the command at once. Frances, reluctant beyond measure to return to the house, in which she felt she would no longer be wanted, which was a perverse imagination, born of her unhappiness, wretched to lose the prospect of help, which she had been beginning to let herself believe in, was yet too shy and too miserable to make any resistance. She remembered her mother's note from Mr. Clarendon before she went away, and she made one last appeal to her aunt. "You will not forget what we were talking about, Aunt Caroline?" "Dear me," said Mrs. Clarendon, putting up her hand to her head. "What was it, Frances? I have such a poor memory, and your father's coming, and all this unexpected happiness, have driven everything else away." Frances went downstairs with a heart so heavy that it seemed to lie dead in her breast. Was there no help for her, then? No help for him, the victim of Constance and of Markham? No way of softening calamity to the old people? Her temper rose as her hopes fell. All so rich, so abounding, but no one who would spare anything out of his superfluity to help the ruined and heartbroken. "Oh, yes," she said to herself in not unnatural bitterness. "The hospitals, yes, and Trotter's buildings in Whitechapel. But for the people to whom they were bound so much more closely, the men who had sat at their tables, whom they had received and made miserable, nothing. Oh, nothing! Not a finger held out to save him. The little countenance that had been like a summer day, so innocent and fresh and candid, was clouded over. Pride prevented. Pride, more effectual than any other defense, the outburst which in other circumstances would have relieved her heart. She sat in her corner, withdrawn as far as possible from Constance, listening dully, making little response. After several questions, her sister turned upon her with a surprise which was natural, too. "What is the matter?" she said. "You don't talk as you used to do. Is it town that has spoiled you? Do you think I will interfere with you? Oh, you need not be at all afraid. I have enough of my own without meddling with you." "I don't know what I have that you could interfere with," said Frances. "Nothing here." "Do you want to quarrel with me?" Constance said. "It is of no use to quarrel. There is nothing to quarrel about. I might have thought you would interfere when you first came to Bogadera. I had people then who seemed to belong to me. But here, you have the first place. Why should I quarrel? You are only coming back to your own." "Fan, for goodness sake, don't speak in that dreadful tone. What have I done? If you think Papa likes me best, you are mistaken. And as for the mother, don't you know her yet? Don't you know that she is nice to everybody, and cares neither for you nor me?" "No," cried Frances, raising herself bolt upright. "I don't know that. How dare you say it, you who are her child? Perhaps you think no one cares. Not one, though you have made an end of my home. Did you hear about George Gaunt? What you have done to him? He is lying in a brain fever, raving, talking forever, day and night. And if he dies, Markham and you will have killed him. You and Markham. But you have been the worst. It will be murder, and you should be killed for it," the girl cried. Her eyes blazed upon her sister in the close enclosure of the little brougham. "You thought he did not care, either, perhaps." "Fan! Good heavens! I think you must be going out of your senses," Constance cried. Frances was not able to say any more. She was stifled by the commotion of her feelings, her heart beating so wildly in her breast, her emotion reaching the intolerable. The brougham stopped, and she sprang out and ran into the house, hurrying upstairs to her own room. Constance, more surprised and disconcerted than she could have believed possible, nevertheless came in with an air of great composure, saying a word in passing to the astonished servant at the door. She was quite amiable always to the people about her. She walked upstairs, remarking, as she passed, a pair of new vases with palms in them, which decorated the staircase, and which she approved. She opened the drawing-room door in her pretty, languid, stately, always leisurely way. "How are you, Mamma?" "Frances has run upstairs, but here am I. Just come back," she said. Lady Markham rose from her seat with a little scream of astonishment. "Constance! It is not possible. Who would have dreamed of seeing you?" she cried. "Oh, yes, it is quite possible," said Constance, when they had kissed with a prolonged encounter of lips and cheeks. "Surely you did not think I could keep very long away?" "My darling, did you get homesick, or mammy sick, as Markham says, after all your philosophy?" "I am so glad to see you, mamma, and looking so well. No, not homesick, precisely, dear mother, but penetrated with the folly of staying there, where nothing was ever doing, when I might have been in the center of everything, which is saying much the same thing, though in different words." "In very different words," said Lady Markham, resuming her seat with a smile. "I see you have not changed at all, Con. Will you have any tea? And did you leave your home there with as little ceremony as you left me?" "May I help myself, mamma? Don't you trouble. It is very nice to see your pretty china, instead of Francis's old bazaar cups, which were much too good for me. Oh, I did not leave my home. I brought it back with me." "You brought?" "My father with me, mamma." "Oh," Lady Markham said. She was too much astonished to say more. "Perhaps it was because he got very tired of me, and thought there was no other way of getting rid of me. Perhaps because he was tired of it himself. He came at last like a lamb. I did not really believe it till we were on the boat, and Algy Muncastle turned up, and I introduced him to my father. You should have seen how he stared." "Oh," said Lady Markham again, and then she added faintly, Is he here?" "You mean Papa? I left him at Aunt Caroline's. In the circumstances, that seemed the best thing to do." Lady Markham leaned back in her chair. She had become very pale. One shock after another had reduced her strength. She closed her eyes while Constance very comfortably sipped her tea. It was not possible that she could have dreamed it, or imagined it, when, on opening her eyes again, she saw Constance sitting by the tea-table with a plate of bread and butter before her. "I have really," she explained seriously, "eaten nothing today." Frances came down some time after, having bathed her eyes and smoothed her hair. It was always smooth like satin, shining in the light. She came in her unobtrusive way, ashamed of herself for her outburst of temper, and determined to be good, whatever might happen. She was surprised that there was no conversation going on. Constance sat in a chair which Frances at once recognized as having been hers from the beginning of time, wondering at her own audacity at having sat in it, when she did not know. Lady Markham was still leaning back in her chair. "Oh, it's nothing. Only a little giddiness. So many strange things are happening. Did you give your Uncle Clarendon my note? I suppose Frances told you, Con, how we have been upset today?" "Upset?" said Constance over her bread and butter. "I should have thought you would have been immensely pleased. It is about Sir Thomas, I suppose?" "About Sir Thomas? Is there any news about Sir Thomas?" said Lady Markham with an elaborately innocent look. "If so, it has not yet been confided to me." And then she proceeded to tell to her daughter the story of Nellie Winterbourne. "I should have thought that would all have been set right in the settlements," Constance said. "So it ought, but she had no one to see to the settlements, no one with a real interest in her, and it was such a magnificent match." "No better than Sir Thomas, mamma." "Ah, Sir Thomas. Is there really a story about Sir Thomas? I can only say, if it is so, that he has never confided it to me." "I hope no mistake will be made about the settlements in that case. And what do you suppose Markham will do?" "What can he do? He will do nothing, Con. You know, after all, that is the rôle that suits him best, even if all had been well, unless Nellie had asked him herself." "Do you think she would have minded, after all this time? But I suppose there's an end of Nellie now," Constance said, regretfully. "I am afraid so," Lady Markham replied. And then, recovering, she began to tell her daughter the news. All the news of this one and the other, which Frances had never been able to understand, which Constance entered into as one to the manner born. They left the subject of Nellie Winterbourne, and not a word was said of young Gaunt and his fever, But apart from these subjects, everything that had happened since Constance left England was discussed between them. They talked and smiled and rippled over into laughter, and passed in review the 1,000 friends whose little follies and freaks both knew, and skimmed across the surface of tragedies with the consciousness that gave piquancy to the amusement of the terrible depths beneath. Frances, keeping behind, not willing to show her troubled countenance, from which the trace of tears were not easily effaced, listened to this light talk with a wonder which almost reached the height of awe. Her mother at least must have many grave matters in her mind, and even on Constance, the consciousness of having stirred up all the quiescent evils in the family history, of her father in England, of the meeting which must take place between the husband and wife so long parted, all by her influence, must have a certain weight. But there they sat and talked and laughed, and shot their little shafts of wit. Frances, at last feeling her heartache too much for further repression, and that the pleasant interchange between her mother and sister exasperated instead of lightened her burdened soul, left them, and sought refuge in a room, where presently she heard their voices again as they came upstairs to dress. Constance's boxes had in the meantime arrived from the railway, and the conversation was very animated upon fashions and new adaptations, and what to wear. Then the door of Constance's room was closed, and Lady Markham came tapping at that of Frances. She took the girl into her arms. "Now," she said, "my dream is going to be realized, and I shall have my 2 girls, one on each side of me. My little Frances, are you not glad?" "Mother," the girl said, faltering, and stopped, not able to say any more. Lady Markham kissed her tenderly, and smiled as if she were content. Was she content? Was the happiness, now she had it, as great as she said? Was she able to be light-hearted with all these complications round her? But to these questions who could give any answer? Presently she went to dress, shutting the door, and, between her 2 girls, retired so many 100, so many 1,000 miles away, who could tell? Into herself. In the evening there was considerable stir and commotion in the house. Markham, warned by one of his mother's notes, came to dinner full of affectionate pleasure in Con's return, and cheerful inquiries for her. "As yet, you have lost nothing, Con. As yet, nobody has got well into the swim. As to how the mammy will feel with 2 daughters to take about, that is a mystery. If we had known, we'd have shut up little Fan in the nursery for a year more." "It is I that should be sent to the nursery," said Constance. 3 months is a long time. Algy Muncastle thought I was dead and buried. He looked at me as if he were seeing a ghost. A girl might just as well be dead and buried as let half the season slip over and never appear." "Unless she were a widow," said Con. "Ah, unless she were a widow, as you say. That changes the face of affairs." Markham made a slight involuntary retreat when he received that blow, but no one mentioned the name of Nellie Winterbourne. It was much too serious to be taken any notice of now. In the brightness of Lady Markham's drawing-room, with all its softened lights, grave subjects were only discussed tête-à-tête. When the company was more than 2, everything took a sportive turn. Of the 2 visitors, however, who came in later, one was not at all disposed to follow this rule. Sir Thomas said but little to Constance, though her arrival was part of the news which had brought him here, but he held Lady Markham's hand with an anxious look into her eyes, and as soon as he could, drew Frances aside to the distant corner in which she was fond of placing herself. "Do you know he has come?" he cried. "I have seen Papa, Sir Thomas, if that is what you mean." "What else could I mean?" said Sir Thomas. "You know how I have tried for this. What did he say? I want to know what disposition he is in." "And what disposition is she in?" "Frances, you and I have a great deal to do. We have the ball at our feet. There is nobody acting in both their interests but you and I." There was something in Frances's eyes and in her look of mute endurance which startled him, even in the midst of his enthusiasm. "What is the matter?" he said. "I have not forgotten our bargain. I will do much for you, if you will work for me. And you want something. Come, tell me what it is." She gave him a look of reproach. Had he, too, forgotten the sick and miserable, the sufferer, of whom no one thought? Sir Thomas, she said, Constance has money. She has stopped at Paris to buy dresses. Oh, give me what is my share. I remember now, he said. Then you know the only thing that anyone can do for me. Oh, Sir Thomas, if you could but give it me now. Shall I speak to your father? He asked. These words Markham heard by chance, as he passed them to fetch something his mother wanted. He returned to where she sat with a curious look in his long twinkling eyes. What is Sir Thomas after? Do you know the silly story that is about? They say that old fellow is after Lady Markham's daughter. It had better be put a stop to, mother. I won't have anything go amiss with little Fan. Go amiss? With Sir Thomas? There is nobody he might not marry, Markham. Not that anything has ever been said. Let him have anybody he pleases except little Fan. I won't have anything happen to Fan. She is not one that would stand it like the rest of us. We are old stagers. We are trained for the stake. We know how to grin and bear it. But that little thing, she has never been brought up to it, and it would kill her. I won't have anything go wrong with little Fan. There is nothing going wrong with Frances. You are not talking with your usual sense, Markham. If that was coming, Frances would be a lucky girl. Markham looked at her with his eyes all pursed up, nearly disappearing in the puckers round them. Mother, he said, we know a girl who was a very lucky girl, you and I. Remember Nellie Winterbourne. It gave Lady Markham a shock to hear Nellie's name. Oh, Markham, the less we say of her, the better, she cried. There was another arrival while they talked. Claude Ramsay, with the flower in his coat, a little rubbed by the greatcoat which he had taken off in the hall, though it was now June. I heard you had come back, he said, dropping languidly into a chair by Constance. I thought I would come and see if it was true. You see it is quite true. Yes, and you are looking as well as possible. Everything seems to agree with you. Do you know, I was very nearly going out to that little place in the Riviera. I got all the renseignements, but then I heard that it got hot and the people went away. You ought to have come. Don't you know it is at the back of the east wind, and there are no drafts there? What an ideal place, said Claude. I shall certainly go next winter, if you are going to be there. End of chapter 45. Recording by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona. Chapter 46 of A House Divided Against Itself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona. A House Divided Against Itself by Margaret O. Oliphant. Chapter 46. Frances slept very little all night. Her mind was jarred and sore almost at every point. The day, with all its strange experiences, and still more strange suggestions, had left her in a giddy round of the unreal, in which there seemed no ground to stand upon. Nellie Winterbourne was the first prodigy in that round of wonders. Why, with that immovable tragic face, had she intimated to Lady Markham the tenure upon which she held her fortune? Why had it been received as something conclusive on all sides? There is an end of Nellie. But why? And then came her mission to her aunt, the impression that had been made on her mind, the hope that had dawned on Frances, and then the event which swept both hope and impression away, and the bitter end that seemed to come to everything in the reappearance of Constance. Was it that she was jealous of Constance? Frances asked herself in the silence of the night, with noiseless, bitter tears. The throbbing of her heart was all pain. Life had become pain, and nothing more. Was it that she was jealous? Jealous of her sister? It seemed to Frances that her heart was being wrung, pressed till the life came out of it in great drops under some giant's hand. She said to herself, No, no. It was only that Constance came in her careless grace, and the place was hers, wherever she came, and all Frances had done, or was trying to do, came to naught. Was that jealousy? She lay awake through the long hours of the summer night, seeing the early dawn grow blue, and then warm and lighten into the light of day. And then all the elements of chaos round her, which whirled and left no honest footing, came to a pause and disappeared, and one thing real, one fact remained: George Gaunt in his fever, lying wrapped from all common life, taking no note of night or day. Perhaps the tide might be turning for death or life, for this was once more the day that might be the crisis. The other matters blended into a phantasmagoria of which Frances could not tell which part was false and which true, or if anything was true. But here was reality beyond dispute. She thought of the pale light stealing into his room, blinding the ineffectual candles, of his weary head on the pillow growing visible, of the long, endless watch, and far away among the mountains, of the old people waiting and praying, and wondering what news the morning would bring them. This thought stung Frances into a keen life and energy, and took from her all reflection upon matters so abstract as that question whether or not she was jealous of Constance. What did it matter, so long as he could be brought back from the gates of death and the edge of the grave, so long as the father and mother could be saved from that awful and murderous blow? She got up hastily long before anyone was stirring. There are moments when all our ineffectual thinkings and even futile efforts end in a sudden determination that the thing must be done, and revelation of how to do it. She got up with a little tremor upon her, such as a great inventor might have when he saw at last his way clearly, or a poet when he had caught the spark of celestial fire. Is there any machine that was ever invented, or even any power so divine as the right way to save a life and deliver a soul? Frances's little frame was all tingling, but it made her mind clear and firm. She asked herself how she could have thought of any other but this way. It was very early in the morning when she set out. If it had not been London, in which no dew falls, the paths would have been wet with dew. Even in London there was a magical something in the air which breathed of the morning, and which not all the housemaids' brooms and tradesmen's carts in the world could dispel. Frances walked on in the stillness, along the long silent line of the park, where there was nobody save a little early schoolmistress, or perhaps a belated man about town, surprised by the morning, with red eyes and furtive looks, in the overcoat which hid his evening clothes, hurrying home, to break the breath of the sunshine, the soft morning light, which was neither too warm nor dazzling, but warmed gently, sweetly to the heart. Her trouble had departed from her in the resolution she had taken. She was very grave, not knowing whether death or life, sorrow or hope, might be in the air, but composed because, whatever it was, it must now come, all being done that man could do. She did not hasten, but walked slowly, knowing how early she was, how astonished her aunt's servants would be to see her, unattended, walking up to the door. I will arise and go to my father. Wherever these words can be said, there is peace in them, a sense of safety at least. There are, alas, many cases in which, with human fathers, they cannot be said. But Waring, whatever his faults might be, had not forfeited his child's confidence, and he would understand. To all human aches and miseries, to be understood is the one comfort above all others. Those to whom she had appealed before had been sorry. They had been astonished. They had gazed at her with troubled eyes. But her father would understand. This was the chief thing and the best. She went along under the trees, which were still fresh and green, through the scene which, a little while later, would be astir with all the movements, the comedies, the tragedies, the confusions and complications of life. But now they lay like a part of the fair silent country, like the paths in a wood, like the glades in a park, all silent and mute. Birds in the branches, dew upon the grass, a place where town had abdicated, where nature reigned. Waring awoke betimes, being accustomed to the early hours of a primitive people. It was a curious experience to him to come down through a closed-up and silent house, where the sunshine came in between the chinks of the shutters, and all was as it had been in the confusion of the night. A frightened maidservant came before him to open the study, which his brother-in-law Clarendon had occupied till a late hour. Traces of the lawyer's vigil were still apparent enough, his waste paper basket full of fragments, the little tray standing in the corner, which, even when holding nothing more than soda water and claret, suggests dissipation in the morning. Waring was jarred by all this unpreparedness. He thought with a sigh of the book-room in the palazzo, all open to the sweet morning air, before the sun had come round that way, and when he stepped out upon the little iron balcony attached to the window, and looked out upon other backs of houses, all crowding round, the recollection of the blue seas, the waving palms, the great peaks, all carved against the brilliant sky, made him turn back in disgust. The mean London walls of yellow brick, the narrow houses, the little windows, all blinded with white blinds and curtains, so near that he could almost touch them. However, it will not be like this at Hillborough, he said to himself. He was no longer in the mood in which he had left Borgadera, but yet, having left it, he was ready to acknowledge that Borgadera was now impossible. His life there had continued from year to year. It might have continued forever, with Francis ignorant of all that had gone before, but the thread of life, once broken, could be knitted again no more. He acknowledged this to himself, and then he found that, in acknowledging it, he had brought himself face to face with all the gravest problems of his life. He had held them at arm's length for years, but now they had to be decided, and there was no alternative. He must meet them. He must look them in the face. And her, too, he must look in the face. Life once more had come to a point at which neither habit nor the past could help him. All over again, as if he were a boy coming of age, it would have to be decided what it should be. Waring was not at all surprised by the appearance of Frances fresh with the morning air about her. It seemed quite natural to him. He had forgotten all about the London streets, and how far it was from one point to another. He thought she had gained much in her short absence from him, perhaps in learning how to act for herself, to think for herself, which she had acquired since she left him, for he was entirely unaware, and even quite incapable of being instructed, that Frances had lived her little life as far apart from him, and been as independent of him while sitting by his side at Borgadera, as she could have been at the other end of the world. But he was impressed by the steady light of resolution, the cause of which was as yet unknown to him, which was shining in her eyes. She told him her story at once, without the little explanations that had been necessary to the others. When she said George Gaunt, he knew all that there was to say. The only thing that it was expedient to conceal was Markham's part in the catastrophe, which was, after all, not at all clear to Frances, and as Waring was not acquainted with Markham's reputation, there was no suggestion in his mind of the name that was wanting to explain how the young officer, knowing nobody, had found entrance into the society which had ruined him. Frances told her tale in few words. She was magnanimous, and said nothing of Constance on the one hand, any more than of Markham on the other. She told her father of the condition in which the young man lay, of his constant mutterings, so painful to hear, the red and black that came up, over and over again, in his confused thoughts, the distracting burden that awaited him if he ever got free of that circle of confusion and pain, of the old people in Switzerland waiting for the daily news, not coming to him as they wished, because of that one dread yet vulgar difficulty which only she understood. Mamma says, of course, they would not hesitate at the expense. Oh, no, no, they would not hesitate. But how can I make her understand? Yet we know. How could she understand? He said with a pale smile, which Frances knew. She has never hesitated. It was all that jarred even upon her excited nerves and mind. The situation was so much more clear to him than to the others, to whom young Gaunt was a stranger. And Waring, too, was in his nature something of a Quixote to those who took him on the generous side. He listened, he understood, he remembered all that had been enacted under his eyes. The young fellow had gone to London in desperation, unsettled and wounded by the woman to whom he had given his love, and he had fallen into the first snare that presented itself. It was weak, it was miserable, but it was not more than a man could understand. When Frances found that at last her object was attained, the unlikeliness that it ever should have been attained overwhelmed her even in the moment of victory. She clasped her arms round her father's arm and laid down her head upon it, and, to his great surprise, burst into a passion of tears. "What is the matter? What has happened? Have I said anything to hurt you?" he cried, half touched, half vexed, not knowing what it was, smoothing her glossy hair half tenderly, half reluctantly, with his disengaged hand. "Oh, it is nothing, nothing. It is my folly. It is happiness. I have tried to tell them all, and no one would understand. But one's father is like no one else," cried Frances, with her cheek upon his sleeve. Waring was altogether penetrated by these simple words, and by the childish action, which reminded him of the time when the little forlorn child he had carried away with him had no one but him in the world. "My dear," he said, "it makes me happy that you think so. I have been rather a failure, I fear, in most things, but if you think so, I can't have been a failure all around." His heart grew very soft over his little girl. He was in a new world, though it was the old one. His sister, whom he had not seen for so long, had half disgusted him with her violent partisanship, though his was the party she upheld so strongly. And Constance, who had no hold of habitual union upon him, had exhibited all her faults to his eyes. But his little girl was still his little girl, and believed in her father. It brought a softening of all the ice and snow about his heart. They walked together through the many streets to inquire for poor Gaunt, and were admitted with shakings of the head and downcast looks. He had passed a very disturbed night, though at present he seemed to sleep. The nurse, who had been up all night, and was much depressed, was afraid that there were symptoms of a change. "I think the parents should be sent for, sir," she said, addressing herself at once to Waring. These attendants did not mind what they said over the uneasy bed. "He don't know what we are saying, any more than the bed he lies on. Look at him, miss, and tell me if you don't think there is a change?" Frances held fast by her father's arm. She was more diffident in his presence than she had been before. The sufferer's gaunt face was flushed. His lips moved, though, in his weakness, his words were not audible. The other nurse, who had come to relieve her colleague, and who was fresh and unwearied, was far more hopeful. But she too thought that a change might be approaching, and that it would be well to summon the friends. She went downstairs with them to talk it over a little more. "It seems to me that he takes more notice than we are aware of," she said. "The ways of sick folks are that wonderful. We don't understand, not the half of them. Seems to me that you have a kind of an influence, miss. Last night he changed after you were here, and took me for his mamma, and asked me what I meant, and said something about a Miss Una that was true, and a false Jessie or something. I wonder if your name is Miss Una, miss?" This inquiry was made while Waring was writing a telegram to the parents. Frances, who was not very quick, could only wonder for a long time who Una was, and Jessie. It was not till evening, nearly 12 hours after, that there suddenly came into her mind the false Duessa of the poet, and then the question remained, who was Una, and who Duessa? A question to which she could find no reply. Frances remained with her father the greater part of the day. When she found that what she desired was to be done, there fell a strange kind of lull into her being, which unaccountably took away her strength, so that she scarcely felt herself able to hold up her head. She began to be aware that she had neither slept by night nor had any peace by day, and that a fever of the mind had been stealing upon her, a sort of reflection of the other fever, in which her patient was enveloped as in a living shroud. She was scarcely able to stand, and yet she could not rest. Had she not put force upon herself, she would have been sending to and fro all day, creeping thither on limbs that would scarcely support her, to know how he was, or if the change had yet appeared. She had not feared for his life before, having no tradition of death in her mind, but now an alarm grew upon her that any moment might see the blow fall, and that the parents might come in vain. It was while she stood at one of the windows of Mrs. Clarendon's gloomy drawing-room, watching for the return of one of her messengers, that she saw her mother's well-known brougham drive up to the door. She turned round with a little cry of "Mamma!" to where her father was sitting, in one of the seldom-used chairs. Mrs. Clarendon, who would not leave him for many minutes, was hovering by, wearying his fastidious mind with unnecessary solicitude and a succession of questions which he neither could nor wished to answer. She flung up her arms when she heard Francis's cry, "Your mother! Oh, has she dared? Edward, go away and let me meet her. She will not get much out of me." "Do you think I am going to fly from my wife?" Waring said. He rose up, very tremulous, yet with a certain dignity. "In that case, I should not have come here." "But, Edward, you are not prepared. Oh, Edward, be guided by me. If you once get into that woman's hands—" "Hush," he said. "Her daughter is here." Then, with a smile, "When a lady comes to see me, I hope I can receive her still as a gentleman should, whoever she may be." The door opened, and Lady Markham came in. She was very pale, yet flushed from moment to moment. She, who had usually such perfect self-command, betrayed her agitation by little movements, by the clasping and unclasping of her hands, by a hurried, slightly audible breathing. She stood for a moment without advancing, the door closing behind her, facing the agitated group. Frances, following an instinctive impulse, went hastily towards her mother as a maid of honor in an emergency might hurry to take her place behind the Queen. Mrs. Clarendon on her side, with a similar impulse, drew nearer to her brother. The way was cleared between the two, once lovers, now antagonists. The pause was but for a moment. Lady Markham, after that hesitation, came forward. She said, "Edward, I should be wanting in my duty if I did not come to welcome you home." "Home," he said, with a curious smile. Then he, too, came forward a little. "I accept your advances in the same spirit, Frances." She was holding out her hands to him with a little appeal, looking at him with eyes that sank and rose again, an emotion that was restrained by her age, by her matronly person, by the dignity of the woman, which could not be quenched by any flood of feeling. He took her hands in his with a strange timidity, hesitating, as if there might be something more, then let them drop, and they stood once again apart. "I have to thank you, too," she said, "for bringing Constance back to me safe and well. And what is more, Edward, for this child." She put out her hand to Frances, and drew her close, so that the girl could feel the agitation in her mother's whole person, and knew that, weak as she was a support to the other who was so much stronger. "I owe you more thanks still for her, that she never had been taught to think any harm of her mother, that she came back to me as innocent and true as she went away. If you found her so, Frances, it was to her own praise rather than mine." "Nay," she said with a tremulous smile, "I have not to learn now that the father of my children was fit to be trusted with a girl's mind, more, perhaps, than their mother, and the world together." She shook off this subject, which was too germane to the whole matter, with a little tremulous movement of her head and hands. "We must not enter on that," she said. "Though I am only a woman of the world, it might be too much for me. Discussion must be for another time, but we may be friends, so far as I am concerned. And I too, Edward. There are things even we might consult about, without prejudice, as the lawyers say, for the children's good. Whatever you wish my advice upon—" "Yes, that is perhaps the way to put it," Lady Markham said, after a pause which looked like disappointment, and with an agitated smile. "Will you be so friendly, then," she added, "as to dine at my house with the girls and me? No one you dislike will be there. Sir Thomas, who is in great excitement about your arrival, and perhaps Claude Ramsay, whom Constance has come back to marry." "Then she has settled that?" I think so, yet no doubt she would like him to be seen by you. I hope you will come, she said, looking up at him with a smile. It will be very strange, he said, to dine as a guest at your table. Yes, Edward, but everything is strange. We are so much older now than we were. We can afford, perhaps, to disagree and yet be friends. I will come if it will give you any pleasure, he said. Certainly it will give me pleasure. She had been standing all the time, not having even been offered a seat, an omission which neither he nor she had discovered. He did it now, placing with great politeness a chair for her, but she did not sit down. For the first time, perhaps it is enough, she said, and Caroline thinks it more than enough. Goodbye, Edward. If you will believe me, I am truly glad to see you, and I hope we may be friends. She half raised her clasped hands again. This time he took them in both his, and leaning towards her, kissed her on the forehead. Frances felt the tremor that ran through her mother's frame. Goodbye, she said, till this evening. Only the girl knew why Lady Markham hurried from the room. She stopped in the hall below to regain her self-command and arrange her bonnet. It is so long since we have met, she said. It upsets me. Can you wonder, Frances? The woman in the end always feels it most. And then there are so many things to upset me just now. Constance and Markham. Say nothing of Markham. Do not mention his name. And even you. There is nothing about me to annoy you, Mamma. Lady Markham smiled with a face that was near crying. She gave a little tap with her finger upon Frances's cheek, and then she hurried away. End of chapter 46. Recording by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona. Chapter 47 of A House Divided Against Itself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona. A House Divided Against Itself by Margaret O. Oliphant, Chapter 47. The dinner, it need scarcely be said, was a strange one, except in Constance, who was perfectly cool, and Claude, who was more concerned about a possible draught from a window than anything else. There was much agitation in the rest of the party. Lady Markham was nervously cordial, anxious to talk and to make everything go, which, indeed, she would have done far more effectually had she been able to retain her usual cheerful and benign composure. But there are some things which are scarcely possible even to the most accomplished women of the world. How to place the guests, even, had been a trouble to her, almost too great to be faced. To place her husband by her side was more than she could bear, and where else could it be appropriate to place him, unless opposite to her, where the master of the house should sit? The difficulty was solved loosely by placing Constance there, and her father beside her. He sat between his daughters, while Ramsay and Sir Thomas were on either side of his wife. Under such circumstances, it was impossible that the conversation could be other than formal, with outbursts of somewhat conventional vivacity from Sir Thomas, supported by anxious responses from Lady Markham. Francis took refuge in saying nothing at all, and Waring sat like a ghost, with a smile on his face in which there was a sort of pathetic humor, dashed with something that was half derision. To be sitting there at all was wonderful indeed, and to be listening to the small talk of a London dinner-table, with all its little discussions, its talk of plays and pictures and people, its scraps of political life behind the scenes, its esoteric revelations on all subjects, was more wonderful still. He had half forgotten it, and to come thus at a single step into the midst of it all, and hear this babble floating on the air which was charged with so many tragic elements, was more wonderful still. To think that they should all be looking at each other across the flowers and the crystal, and knowing what questions were to be solved between them, yet talking and expecting others to talk of the new tenor and the last scandal. It seemed to the stranger out of the wilds, who had been banished from society so long, that it was a thing incredible when he was thus thrown into it again. There were allusions to many things which he did not understand. There was something, for instance, about Nellie Winterbourne which called forth a startling response from Lady Markham. "You must not," she said, "say anything about poor Nellie in this house. From my heart, I am sorry and grieved for her, but in the circumstances, what can anyone do? The least said, the better, especially here." The pause after this was minute but marked, and Waring asked Constance, "Who is Nellie Winterbourne?" "She is a young widow, Papa. It was thought her husband had left her a large fortune, but he has left it to her on the condition that she should not marry again." "Is that why she is not to be spoken of in this house?" said Waring, growing red. This explanation had been asked and given in an undertone. He thought it referred to the circumstances in which his own marriage had taken place, Lady Markham being a young widow with a large jointure, and that this was the reason why the other was not to be mentioned, and it gave him a hot sense of offense, restrained by the politeness which is exercised in society, but not always when the offenders are one's wife and children. It turned the tide of softened thoughts back upon his heart, and increased to fierceness the derision with which he listened to all the trifles that floated uppermost. When the ladies left the room, he did not meet the questioning, almost timid, look that Lady Markham threw upon him. He saw it, indeed, but he would not respond to it. That allusion had spoiled all the rest. In the little interval after dinner, Claude Ramsay did his best to make himself agreeable. "I am very glad to see you back, sir," he said. "I told Lady Markham it was the right thing. When a girl has a father, it's always odd that he shouldn't appear." "Oh, you told Lady Markham that it was the right thing?" "A coincidence, wasn't it? When you were on your way," said Claude, perceiving the mistake he had made. "You know, sir," he added with a little hesitation, "that it has all been made up for a long time between Constance and me." "Yes? What has all been made up? I understand that my daughter came out to me to—" "Oh," said Claude, interrupting hurriedly, "it is that has all been made up. Constance has been very nice about it," he continued. "She has been making a study of the Riviera and collecting all sorts of renseignements, for in most cases it is necessary for me to winter abroad." "That was what she was doing then? Her object, I suppose?" said Waring, with a grim smile. "Besides the pleasure of visiting you, sir," said Claude, with what he felt to be great tact. "She seems to have done a great deal of exploring, and she tells me she has found just the right site for the villa, and all the renseignements," he added. "To have been on the spot and studied the aspect, and how the winds blow, is such a great thing, and to be near your place, too," he said politely, by an afterthought. "Which I hope is to be your place no more, Waring," said Sir Thomas. "Your own place is very empty and craving for you all the time." "It is too fine a question to say what is my own place," he said with that pale, indignant smile. "Things are seldom made any clearer by an absence of a dozen years." "A great deal clearer. The mist blow away and the hot fumes. Come, Waring, say you are glad you have come home." "I suppose," said Claude, "you find it really too hot for summer on that coast. What would you say was the end of the season? May? Just when London begins to be possible, and most people have come to town." "Is not that one of the renseignements Constance has given you?" Waring asked with a short laugh, but he made no reply to the other questions. And then there was a little of the inevitable politics before the gentlemen went upstairs. Lady Markham had been threatened with what in Francis is called an attaque de neuf when she reached the shelter of the drawing-room. She was a little hysterical, hardly able to get the better of the sobbing which assailed her. Constance stood apart and looked on with a little surprise. "You know, Mamma," she said reflectively, "an effort is the only thing. With an effort you can stop it." Frances was differently affected by this emotion. She, who had never learned to be familiar, stole behind her mother's chair and made her breast a pillow for Lady Markham's head. a breast in which the heart was beating now high, now low, with excitement and despondency. She did not say anything, but there is sometimes comfort in a touch. It helped Lady Markham to subdue the unwanted spasm. She held close for a moment the arms which were over her shoulders, and she replied to Constance, "Yes, that is true. I am ashamed of myself. I ought to know better, at my age." "It has gone off on the whole very well," Constance said, and then she retired to a sofa and took up a book. Lady Markham held Frances's hand in hers for a moment or two longer, then drew her towards her and kissed her, still without a word. They had approached nearer to each other in that silent encounter than in all that had passed before. Lady Markham's heart was full of many commotions. The past was rising up around her with all its agitating recollections. She looked back and saw, oh, so clearly in that pale light which can never alter, the scenes that ought never to have been, the words that ought never to have been said, the faults, the mistakes, those things which were fixed there forever, not to be forgotten. Could they ever be forgotten? Could any postscript be put to the finished story? Or was this strange meeting, unsought, scarcely desired on either side, into which the separated two, who ought to have been one, seemed to have been driven without any will of their own? Was it to be mere useless additional pain, and no more? The ladies were all very peacefully employed when the gentlemen came upstairs. Lady Markham turned round as usual from her writing table to receive them with a smile. Constance laid down her book. Frances, from her accustomed dim corner, lifted up her eyes to watch them as they came in. They stood in the middle of the room for a minute, and talked to each other according to the embarrassed usage of Englishmen, and then they distributed themselves. Sir Thomas fell to Frances's share. He turned to her eagerly, and took her hand and pressed it warmly. "We have done it," he said in an excited whisper. "So far all is victorious, but still there is a great deal more to do." "I think it is Constance that has done it," Frances said. "She has worked for us without meaning it, no doubt. But I am not going to give up the credit to Constance, and there is still a great deal to do. You must not lay down your arms, my dear. You and I, we have the ball at our feet, but there is a great deal still to do." Frances made no reply. The corner which she had chosen for herself was almost concealed behind a screen, which parted the room in two. The other group made a picture far enough withdrawn to gain perspective. Waring stood near his wife, who from time to time gave him a look, half watchful, half wistful, and sometimes made a remark, to which he gave a brief reply. His attitude and hers told a story, but it was a confused and uncertain one, of which the end was all darkness. They were together, but fortuitously, without any will of their own, and between them was a gulf fixed. Which would cross it, or was it possible that it ever could be crossed at all? The room was very silent, for the conversation not lively between Constance and Claude on the sofa, and Sir Thomas was silent, watching too. All was so quiet indeed that every sound was audible without, but there was no expectation of any interruption. Nobody looked for anything. There was a perfect indifference to outside sounds. So much so that for a moment the ladies were scarcely startled by the familiar noise, so constantly heard, of Markham's hansom drawing up at the door. It could not be Markham. He was out of the way, disposed of till next morning. But Lady Markham, with that presentiment which springs up most strongly when every avenue by which harm can come seems stopped, started, then rose to her feet with alarm. "It can't surely be! Oh, what has brought him here?" she cried, and looked at Claude, to bid him, with her eyes, rush to meet him, stop him, keep him from coming in. But Claude did not understand her eyes. As for Waring, seeing that something had gone wrong in the program, but not guessing what it was, he accepted her movement as a dismissal, and quietly joined his daughter and his friend behind the screen. The two men got behind it all together, showing only where their heads passed its line. But the light was not bright in that corner, and the newcomer was full of his own affairs. For it was Markham, who came in rapidly, stopped by no wise agent or suggestion of expediency. He came into the room dressed in light morning clothes, greenish, grayish, yellowish, like the color of his sandy hair and complexion. He came in with his face puckered up and twitching, as it did when he was excited. His mother, Constance, Claude, sunk in the corner of the sofa, were all he saw, and he took no notice of Claude. He crossed that little opening amid the fashionably crowded furniture and went and placed himself in front of the fireplace, which was full of this season of flowers, not of fire. From that point of vantage he greeted them with his usual laugh, but broken and embarrassed. "Well, Mother! Well, Con! You thought you were clear of me for tonight." "I did not expect you, Markham. Has anything gone wrong?" he said. "No, I don't know that anything has gone wrong. That depends on how you look at it. I've been in the country all day." "Yes, Markham, so I know." "But not where I was going," he said. His laugh broke out again, quite irrelevant and inappropriate. "I've seen Nellie," he said. "Markham!" his mother cried, with a tone of wonder, disapproval, indignation, such as had never been heard in her voice before, through all that had been said and understood concerning Markham and Nellie Winterbourne. She had sunk into her chair, but now rose again in distress and anxiety. "Oh," she cried, "how could you? How could you? I thought you had some true feeling. Oh, Markham, how unworthy of you now to vex and compromise that poor girl!" He made no answer for a moment, but moistened his lips with a sound that seemed like a ghost of the habitual chuckle. "Yes," he said, "I know you made it all up, that the chapter was closed now, but I never said so, Mother. Nellie's where she was before, when we hadn't the courage to do anything. Only worse. She'd been put in bondage by that miserable beggar's will, and you all took it for granted that there was an end between her and me. I was waiting to marry her when she was free and rich, you all thought. But I wasn't bound, to be sure, nor the sort of man to think of it twice when I knew she would be poor." "Markham, no one ever said, nobody thought—" "Oh, I know very well what people thought, and said, too, for that matter," said Markham. "I hope a fellow like me knows society well enough for that. A pair of old stagers like Nellie and me, of course we knew what everybody said. Well, Mammy, you're mistaken this time, that's all. There's nothing to be taken for granted in this world. Nellie's game, and so am I. As soon as it's what you call decent, and the crepe business done with, for she has always done her duty by him, the wretched fellow, as everybody knows—" "Markham!" his mother cried, almost with a shriek. "Why, it is ruin, destruction! I must speak to Nellie. Ruin both to her and you." He laughed. "Or else the t'other thing. Salvation, you know. Anyhow, Nellie's game for it, and so am I." There suddenly glided into the light at this moment a little figure, white, rapid, noiseless, and caught Markham's arm in both hers. "Oh, Markham," cried Frances. "I am so glad. I never believed it. I always knew it. I am so glad," and began to cry, clinging to his arm. Markham's puckered countenance twitched and puckered more and more. His chuckle sounded over her half like a sob. "Look here," he said. "Here's the little one approves. She's the one to judge, the sort of still, small voice. Eh, Mother? Come, I've got far better than I deserve. I've got little Fan on my side." Lady Markham wrung her hands with an impatience which partly arose from her own better instincts. The words which she wanted would not come to her lips. "The child, what can she know?" she cried, and could say no more. "Stand by me, little Fan," said Markham, holding his sister close to him. "Mother, it's not a small thing that could part you and me. That is what I feel, nothing else. For the rest, we'll take the Priory, Nellie and I, and be very jolly upon nothing. Mother, you didn't think in your heart that your son was a base little beggar, no better than Winterbourne?" Lady Markham made no reply. She sank down in her chair and covered her face with her hands. In the climax of so many emotions, she was overwhelmed. She could not stand up against Markham. In her husband's presence, with everything hanging in the balance, she could say nothing. The worldly wisdom she had learned melted away from her. Her heart was stirred to its depths, and the conventional bonds restrained it no more. A kind of sweet bitterness, a sense of desertion, yet hope, of secret approval, yet opposition, disabled her altogether. One or two convulsive sobs shook her frame. She was able to say nothing, and was silent, covering her face with her hands. Waring had seen Markham come in with angry displeasure. He had listened with that keen curiosity of antagonism, which is almost as warm as the interest of love, to hear what he had to say. Sir Thomas, standing by his side, threw in a word or two to explain, seeing an opportunity in this new development of affairs. But nothing was really altered until Frances rose. Her father watched her with a poignant anxiety, wonder, excitement, when she threw herself upon her brother's arm, and, all alone in her youth, gave him her approval. The effect upon the mind of her father was very strange. He frowned and turned away, then came back and looked again. His daughter, his little white spotless child, thrown upon the shoulder of the young man whom he had believed he hated, his wife's son, who had been always in his way. It was intolerable. He must spring forward, he thought, and pluck her away. But Markham's stifled cry of emotion and happiness somehow arrested Waring. He looked again, and there was something tender, pathetic in the group. He began to perceive dimly how it was. Markham was making a resolution which, for a man of his kind, was heroic, and the little sister, the child, his own child, of his training, not of the world, had gone in her innocence and consecrated it with her approval. The approval of little Frances, and Markham had the heart to feel that in that approval there was something beyond and above everything else that could be said to him. Waring, too, like his wife, was in a condition of mind which offered no defense against the first touch of nature, which was strong enough to reach him. He was open not to everyday reasoning, but to the sudden prick of a keen, unhabitual feeling. A sudden impulse came upon him in this softened, excited mood. Had he paused to think, he would have turned his back upon that scene and hurried away, to be out of the contagion. But, fortunately, he did not pause to think. He went forward quickly, laying his hand upon the back of the chair in which Lady Markham sat, struggling for calm, and confronted his old antagonist, his boy enemy of former times, who recognized him suddenly with a gasp of astonishment. "Markham," he said, "if I understand rightly, you are acting like a true and honorable man. Perhaps I have not done you justice hitherto. Your mother does not seem able to say anything. I believe in my little girl's instinct. If it will do you any good, you have my approval too." Markham's slackened arm dropped to his side, though Frances embraced it still. His very jaw dropped in the amazement, almost consternation, of this sudden appearance. "Sir," he stammered, your support, your friendship would be all I could—" and here his voice failed him, and he said no more. Then Waring went a step further by an unaccountable impulse, which afterwards he could not understand. He held out one hand, still holding with the other the back of Lady Markham's chair. "I know what the loss will be to your mother," he said, "but perhaps, if she pleases, that may be made up too." She removed her hands suddenly and looked up at him. There was not a particle of color in her cheek. The hurrying of her heart parched her open lips. The two men clasped hands over her, and she saw them through a mist, for a moment, side by side. At this moment of extreme agitation and excitement, Lady Markham's butler suddenly opened the drawing-room door. He came in with that solemnity of countenance with which, in his class, it is thought proper to name all that is preliminary to death. "If you please, my lady," he said, "there's a man below has come to say that the fever's come to a crisis, and that there's a change." "You mean Captain Gaunt?" cried Lady Markham, rising with a half-stupefied look. She was so much worn by these diverse emotions that she did not see where she went. "Captain Gaunt," said Constance with a low cry. End of chapter 47. Recording by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona. Chapter 48 of A House Divided Against Itself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona. A House Divided Against Itself by Margaret O. Oliphant, Chapter 48. Lady Markham was a woman, everybody knew, who never hesitated when she realized a thing to be her duty, especially in all that concerned hospitals and the sick. She appeared by George Gaunt's bedside in the middle of what seemed to him a terrible, long, endless night. It was not yet midnight, indeed, but they do not reckon by hours in the darkness through which he was drifting, through which there flashed upon his eyes confused gleams of scenes that were like scenes upon a stage all surrounded by darkness. The change had come. One of the nurses, the depressed one, thought it was for death. The other, possessed by the excitement of that great struggle, in which sometimes it appears that one human creature can visibly help another to hold the last span of soil on which human foot can stand, stood by the bed, almost carried away by what to her was like the frenzy of battle to a soldier, watching to see where she could strike a blow at the adversary or drag the champion a hair's breadth further on the side of victory. There appeared to him at that moment two forms floating in the air, both white, bright, with a light upon them, radiant as with some glory of their own to the gaze of fever. He remembered them afterwards as if they had floated out of the chamber, disembodied, two faces, nothing more, and then all again was night. "He's talked a deal about his mother, poor gentleman. He'll never live to see his mother," said the melancholy attendant, shaking her head. "Hush," said the other under her breath. "Don't you know we can't tell what he hears and what he don't hear?" Lady Markham was of this opinion too. She called the doleful woman with her outside the door, and left the last battle to be fought out. Frances stood on the other side of the bed. How she came there, why she was allowed to come, neither she nor anyone knew. She stood looking at him with an awe in her young soul which silenced every other feeling. Nellie Winterbourne had been afraid of death, of seeing or coming near it, but Frances was not afraid. She stood, forgetting everything, with her head thrown back, her eyes expanded, her heart dilating and swelling in her bosom. She seemed to herself to be struggling too, gasping with his efforts for breath, helping him. Oh, if she could help him! Saying her simple prayers involuntarily, sometimes aloud. Over and over again, in the confusion and darkness and hurrying of the last battle, there would come to him a glimpse of that face. It floated over him, the light all concentrated in it, then rolling clouds and gloom. It was nearly morning when the doctor came. "Still living?" "Alive, but that is all," was the brief interchange outside the door. He would have been surprised, had he had any time for extraneous emotions, to see on the other side of the patient's bed, softly winnowing the air with a large fan, a girl in evening dress, pearls gleaming upon her white neck, standing rapt and half unconscious in the midst of the unwonted scene. But the doctor had no time to be surprised. He went through his examination in that silence which sickens the very heart of the lookers-on. Then he said briefly, "It all depends now on the strength whether we can pull him through. The fever is gone, but he is as weak as water. Keep him in life 12 hours longer, and he'll do." 12 hours? One whole long, lingering, endless summer day. Lady Markham, with her own affairs at such a crisis, had not hesitated. She came in now, having got a change of dress, and sent the weary nurse, who had stood over him all night, away. lest it be fashion when its fads are for angels' work. Noiselessly into the room came with her, clean, fresh, and cool, everything that could restore. The morning light came softly in, the air from the open windows. Freshness and hope were in her face. She gave her daughter a look, a smile. "He may be weak, but he has never given in," she said. Reinforcements upon the field of battle. In a few hours, which were as a year, the hopeful nurse was back again refreshed. And thus the endless day went on. Noon, and still he lived. Markham walked about the little street with his pockets full of small moneys, buying off every costermonger or wandering street vendor of small wares, boldly interfering with the liberty of the subject, stopping indignant cabs, and carts half paralyzed with slow astonishment. It was scarcely necessary, for the patient's brain was not yet sufficiently clear to be sensitive to noises, but it was something to do for him. A whole cycle of wonder had gone round, but there was no time to think of it in the absorbing interest of this. Waring had employed his wife's son to clear off those debts, which, if the old general ever knew of them, would add stings to sorrow, which, if the young man mended, would be a crushing weight round his neck. Waring had done this without a word or look that interfered that Markham was to blame. The age of miracles had come back, but, as would happen, perhaps if that age did come back, no one had time or thought to give to the prodigies, for the profounder interest which no wonder could equal, the fight between death and life, the sudden revelation, in common life, of all the mysteries that make humanity what it is, the love which made a little worldling triumph over every base suggestion, the pity that carried a woman out of herself and her own complicated affairs to stand by another woman's son in the last mortal crisis, the nature which suspended life in every one of all these differing human creatures and half obliterated, in thought of another, the interests that were their own. Through the dreadful night and through the endless sunshine of that day, a June day, lavish of light and pleasure, reluctant to relinquish a moment of its joy and triumph, the height of summer days, the old people, the old general and his wife, the father and mother, traveled without pause, with few words, with little hope, daring to say nothing to each other except faint questions and calculations as to when they could be there. When they could be there! They did not put the other question to each other, but within themselves repeated it without ceasing. Would they be there before? Would they be there in time? To see him once again. They scarcely breathed when the cab, blundering along, got to the entrance of a little street, where it was stopped by a wild figure in a grey overcoat, which rushed at the horse and held him back. Then the old general rose in his wrath. "Drive on, man! Drive on! Ride him down, whoever the fool is!" And then, somewhat as those faces had appeared at the sick man's bedside, there came at the cab window an ugly little face, all puckers and light, half recognized as a bringer of good tidings, half hated as an obstruction, saying, all right, I'm here to stop noises. He's going to pull through." "Mamma," said Constance next evening, when all their excitement and emotions were softened down, "I hope you told Mrs. Gaunt that I had been there?" "My dear, Mrs. Gaunt was not thinking of either you or me. Perhaps she might be conscious of Francis. I don't know even that. When one's child is dying, it does not matter to one who shows feeling. By and by, no doubt, she will be grateful to us all." "Not to me, never to me." "Perhaps she has no reason, Con," her mother said. "I am sure I cannot tell you, Mamma. If he had died, of course, though even that would not have been my fault. I amused him very much for 6 weeks, and then he thought I behaved very badly to him. But all the time I felt sure that it would really do him no harm. I think it was cheap to buy at that price all your interest in everything that has been done for him, not to speak of the experience in life." Lady Markham shook her head. "Our experiences in life are sometimes not worth the price we pay for them, and to make another pay—" "Oh!" said Constance with a toss of her head, shaking off self-reproach and the smiled answer together. "It appears that there is some post his father wants for him to keep him at home, and Claude will move heaven and earth, that's to say, the horse guards and all the other authorities, to get it. Mamma," she added after a pause, "Francis will marry him, if you don't mind." "Marry him?" cried Lady Markham with a shriek of alarm. "That is what can never be." Meanwhile, Francis was walking back from Mrs. Gaunt's lodging, where the poor lady, all tremulous and shaken with joy and weariness, had been pouring into her sympathetic ears all the anguish of the waiting, now so happily over, and weeping over the kindness of everybody. Everybody was so kind. What would have happened had not everybody been so kind? Francis had soothed her into calm, and coming downstairs, had met Sir Thomas at the door with his inquiries. He looked a little grave, she thought, somewhat preoccupied. "I am very glad," he said, "to have the chance of a talk with you, Francis. Are you going to walk? Then I will see you home." Francis looked up in his face with simple pleasure. She tripped along by his side like a little girl, as she was. They might have been father and daughter smiling to each other, a pretty sight as they went upon their way. But Sir Thomas's smile was grave. "I want to speak to you on some serious subjects," he said. "About Mamma? Oh, don't you think, Sir Thomas, it is coming all right?" "Not about your mother. It is coming all right, thank God, better than I ever hoped. This is about myself. Francis, give me your advice. You have seen a great deal since you came to town. What with Nellie Winterbourne and poor young Gaunt, and all that has happened in your own family, you have acquired what Con calls experience in life." Francis's small countenance grew grave too. "I don't think it can be true life," she said. He gave a little laugh in which there was a tinge of embarrassment. "From your experience," he said, "tell me, would you ever advise, Francis, a marriage between a girl like you, mind you, a good girl, that would do her duty, not in Nellie Winterbourne's way, and an elderly, rather worldly man?" "Oh, no, no, Sir Thomas," cried the girl, and then she paused a little, and said to herself that perhaps she might have hurt Sir Thomas's feelings by so distinct an expression. She faltered a little and added, "It would depend, wouldn't it, upon who they were?" "A little, perhaps," he said, "but I am glad I have had your first unbiased judgment. Now for particulars. The man is not a bad old fellow, and would take care of her. He is rich, and would provide for her, not like that hound Winterbourne. Oh, you need not make that gesture, my dear, as if money meant nothing, for it means a great deal, and the girl is as good a little thing as ever was born. Society has got talking about it, it has been spread abroad everywhere, and perhaps, if it comes to nothing, it may do her harm. Now, with those further lights, let me have your deliverance. And remember, it is very serious, not play at all." "I have not enough lights, Sir Thomas. Does she," said Francis with a slight hesitation, "love him, and does he love her?" "He is very fond of her, I'll say that for him," said Sir Thomas hurriedly. "Not perhaps in the boy and girl way. And she, well, if you put me to it, I think she likes him, Francis. They are as friendly as possible together. She would go to him, I believe, with any of her little difficulties, and he has as much faith in her, as much faith as in— I can't put a limit to his faith in her," he said. Francis looked up at him with the grave, judicial look into which she had been forming her soft face. "All you say, Sir Thomas, looks like a father and child. I would do that to Papa, or to you." Here he burst, to her astonishment, into a great fit of laughter, not without a little tremor, as of some other feeling in it. "You are a little Daniel," he said. "That's quite conclusive, my dear. O wise young judge, how I do honor thee!" "But," Francis cried, a little bewildered. Then she added, "Well, you may laugh at me if you like. Of course I am no judge, but if the gentleman is so like her father, cannot she be quite happy in being fond of him, instead of— Oh, no, marrying is quite different. Quite different. I feel sure she would think so, if you were to ask her, herself," she said. And what about the poor old man? You did not say he was a poor old man. You said he was elderly, which means about my age. That is not an old man. And worldly, which is not like you. I think, if he is what you say, that he would like better to keep his friend, because people can be friends, Sir Thomas, don't you think, though one is young and one is old? Certainly, Francis. Witness you and me. She took his arm affectionately of her own accord and gave it a little kind pressure. That is just what I was thinking, she said, with the pleasantest smile in the world. Sir Thomas took Lady Markham aside in the evening and repeated this conversation. I don't know who can have put such an absurd rumour about, he said. Nor I, said Lady Markham, but there are rumours about everyone. It is not worth while taking any notice of them. But if I had thought Francis would have liked it, I should never have hesitated a moment. She might not what you call like it, said Lady Markham dubiously, and yet she might be talked into it for her good? I wonder, said Sir Thomas with spirit, whether my old friend, who has always been a model woman in my eyes, thinks that would be very creditable to me? Lady Markham gave a little conscious guilty laugh, and then, oddly enough, which was so unlike her, 24 hours in a sick room is trying to anyone, began to cry. You flatter me with reproaches, she said. Markham asked me if I expect my son to be base, and you ask me how I can be so base myself, being your model woman. I am not a model woman. I am only a woman of the world that has been trying to do my best for my own. And look there, she said, drying her eyes. I have succeeded very well with Con. She will be quite happy in her way. And now, said Sir Thomas after a pause, dear friend, who are still my model woman, how about your own affairs? She blushed celestial rosy red, as if she had been a girl. Oh, she said, I'm going down with Edward to Hillborough to see what it wants to make it habitable. If it is not too damp, and we can get it put in order, I am quite up in the sanitary part of it, you know. He means to send the Gaunts there with their son to recruit, when he is well enough. I am so glad to be able to do something for his old neighbours. And then we shall have time ourselves, before the season is over, to settle what we shall do. The reader is far too knowing in such matters not to be able to divine how the marriages followed each other in the Waring family within the course of that year. Young Gaunt, when he got better, confused with his illness, soothed by the weakness of his convalescence and all the tender cares about him, came at last to believe that the debts which had driven him out of his senses had been nothing but a bad dream. He consulted Markham about them, detailing his broken recollections. Markham replied with a perfectly opaque countenance, You must have been dreaming, old man. Nightmares take that form the same as another. Never heard half a word from any side about it, and you know those fellows, if you owed them sixpence and didn't pay, would publish it in every club in London. It has been a bad dream. But look here, he added, don't you ever go in for that sort of thing again. Your head won't stand it. I'm going to set you the example, he said, with his laugh. Never, if I should live to be 100, Gaunt cried with fervour. The sensation of this extraordinary escape, which he could not understand, the relief of having nothing to confess to the General, nothing to bring tears from his mother's eyes, affected him like a miraculous interposition of God, which no doubt it was, though he never knew how. There was another vision which belonged to the time of his illness, but which was less apocryphal, as it turned out, the vision of those two forms through mist, of one, all white, with pearls on the milky throat, which had been somehow accompanied in his mind with a private comment that at last, false Duessa being gone forever, the true Una had come to him. After a while, in the greenness of Hillborough, amid the cool shade, he learned to fathom how that was. But were we to enter into all the processes by which Lady Markham changed from the "that can never be" of her first light on the subject, to giving a reluctant consent to Francis's marriage, we should require another volume. It may be enough to say that in after days, Captain Gaunt, but he was then Colonel, thought Constance a very handsome woman, yet could not understand how anyone in his senses could consider the wife of Claude Ramsay worthy of a moment's comparison with his own. Handsome, yes, no doubt, he would say, and so is Nellie Markham, for that matter. But of the earth, earthy, or of the world, worldly, whereas Frances... Words failed to express the difference, which was one with which words had nothing to do. End of chapter 48. Recording by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona. End of A House Divided Against Itself by Margaret O. Oliphant.